The maintenance cart was parked in front of the wrong door. Iris Calder noticed it the way she noticed everything now, without deciding to. A flat, automatic scan that ran under her thoughts like a second pulse. Corridor 7 had 4 exits. The cart, wheels locked, drums stacked with coolant canisters that had no reason to be near a lecture wing, sat in front of the one that led to open concourse and witnesses. 3 cameras along this stretch of ceiling should have shown a faint blue standby ring around their housings. All 3 were dark. She kept walking. Her boots made the same even sound on the decking they always made, unhurried, and she let her bag stay slung low on one shoulder. And she did not look up at the dead cameras a second time, because looking twice was the kind of thing that told a watcher you had seen something the first time. Behind her, applied kinetics let out in a loose flood of cadets, 41 species mixed voices bouncing off brushed alloy walls that were built to look like nothing in particular, because Meridian Vantage Combined Officer Academy was, above everything else, a building that wanted to be neutral. Neutral ground. Neutral walls. A neutral hallway that 4 exits fed into, 3 of them now, because someone had decided the 4th belonged to them. Iris was 19 years old. She had scored perfect marks on the reflex lag component of that morning's kinetics trial, the one that had put 2 cadets in the infirmary with pulled shoulders trying to match her time, and she had eaten her lunch afterward at her usual pace, in her usual seat, and told no one it had been easy, because it had been easy, and saying so would have been a kind of boasting she didn't have in her. The instructor running the trial had called her back afterward, a squat, careful Ithil veteran named Senek who taught kinetics the way Iris imagined some species taught theology, with a reverence for the material that occasionally slipped past professional distance. He'd studied her results on a slate for a long moment, said nothing about the 2 injured cadets, and asked instead, quietly, whether she'd ever considered that her baseline might simply be miscalibrated against the wrong population entirely. She told him she hadn't thought about it much. That had been true, mostly, right up until the maintenance cart outside the lecture hall door gave her a considerably more immediate reason to. She had grown up on a moon that ate the careless. This was not that. This was worse in a specific, quiet way, and she felt the shape of it settle into her stomach 2 full steps before Ilan Vosk's voice caught up to her from behind, bright and lazy, with the particular cruelty of someone who had never once been afraid in his life. "Calder, you're limping." She wasn't. Ilan Vosk knew she wasn't. That was the game. He was Corvin, slate purple, tall in the loose-jointed way of a species built for negotiation tables rather than corridors, and he had decided in the first week of the term that human cadets were a diversity quota wearing a uniform, and he had never once updated that opinion in the face of contrary data, because updating opinions in the face of contrary data was, ironically, not a Corvin specialty when the opinion in question was comfortable. "You beat the lag trial by 4/10", he said, falling into step beside her, 2 of his cluster trailing a pace back, "and you walk like something's wrong with you. It's called overcorrection, Calder. Your nervous system doesn't know what to do with a win." Fascinating from a xenobiology standpoint. I might write a paper. "Write it," Iris said, and kept walking. That was the whole exchange. It was always the whole exchange. Vosk wanted heat, wanted her voice to climb half a register so he could point at it in front of his cluster and say "see," and she had learned in her first month at the Vantage that giving a Corvin heat was like giving a fire more air. She gave him nothing. He drifted off toward the transit lift with his 2 shadows, already bored, already hunting for someone else's temperature to raise, and Iris kept her eyes forward and her weight balanced over the balls of her feet, and did the thing she had actually been doing since the cart, which was counting doors. 4 exits, 1 blocked by cargo that didn't belong. 3 dead cameras in a corridor that had never had a dead camera in 6 months of her walking it twice a day. She slowed by half a step, not enough to be visible, enough to let the flow of cadets around her thin, Most of them peeled off toward the transit lift behind Vosk. A knot of 5 or 6 kept walking her direction, toward the spindle, the long transit corridor that split the lecture wing from the officer dormitories. Because the spindle was the fast way home, and cadets always took the fast way home. A maintenance worker straightened up from the cart as she passed it. Scarn. Green-scaled reptilian, built long and low through the shoulders in the way that species carried its weight when it meant to move fast, wearing a coverall 2 sizes too clean for someone who worked coolant lines. His eyes tracked her for exactly as long as a stranger's eyes should, and then a half-second longer. And in that half-second Iris understood 3 things at once, cold and complete, the way understanding arrived when there was no time left to arrange it prettier. He wasn't station maintenance. He wasn't alone. And he was waiting for her specifically, not for whoever came through the corridor next. She didn't run. Running told them you'd made them. She let her stride carry her 3 more steps into the spindle, past the blocked exit, into the long straight corridor with its high windows and its rows of alcove lockers. And she did the math the way she always did math, flat and without panic, because panic was a luxury item and she had never been issued one. 6 cadets ahead of her in the corridor, backpacks, unaware. 1 dead camera stretch, 40 meters of it. 1 maintenance worker who wasn't. At minimum 1 more of him somewhere she hadn't spotted yet, because nobody ran a blocked exit and 3 dark cameras with a single body. Behind her, soft and only just audible under the ambient hum of the ventilation, she heard the cart's wheels unlock. Iris turned her head, unhurried, the way she'd turn to check a clock. The scarn in the coverall had a blade out low against his leg, held the correct way, the way someone trained held a blade they intended to use rather than show, and he was closing the gap behind her at a walk that was building, quietly, into something faster. She didn't reach for anything. She had nothing to reach for. Cadets went to applied kinetics unarmed. That was the entire premise. What she had was 40 meters of corridor, 6 locker alcoves, a fire suppression panel, an emergency bulkhead release she'd read the manual for in her first week out of boredom, and the particular, specific advantage of being the only person in that hallway who had already finished being afraid. "Get to the wing doors," she said low to the nearest cluster of cadets, a trio of first-years who hadn't noticed anything yet, who turned toward her voice with the slow confusion of people who'd never once needed to move fast in their lives. "Now, don't run for the lift, run for the wing doors." One of them, maroon, mottled gray, 4 soft manipulator limbs folding in surprise, opened her round mouth to ask why. The scarn behind Iris stopped walking and started running. Iris put the maroon cadet behind her with 1 flat hand on the shoulder, a shove more than a gesture, sent the whole trio stumbling toward the wing doors 40 meters up, and turned to meet the blade coming at her throat with the particular, procedural calm of someone doing a job she had, in fact, been doing her entire life. The knife came in on a line meant for the soft triangle under her jaw, a killing angle, not a warning one, and Iris read it in the shoulder before it ever reached the wrist, the way she'd been reading shoulders since she was 7 years old and her father had made her stand in a grain silo doorway and watch a storm-scarred ridgeback work out which of the herd to take. She didn't block it. Blocking a knife with your forearm was a thing that worked in training halls with padded blades and stopped working the instant the edge was real. She stepped inside the line instead, closing the distance the attacker had built speed to cross, turning the blade's arc into empty air behind her shoulder, and drove the heel of her palm up under his jaw with her whole weight behind it. His head snapped back. The knife skittered off down the corridor, spinning, and he went down against a locker alcove hard enough to dent the composite and did not get up. Iris didn't watch him fall. She was already turning, because a professional didn't come alone, and the coverall's collar mic clipped to his shoulder had already crackled once, a short burst of a language she didn't speak but recognized the cadence of a check-in, or a call for the rest of the team. 3 more came through the wing doors behind her, from the direction she'd just sent the cadets. She felt something in her chest go very quiet and very still, the specific stillness of a mistake she needed to fix immediately, and without any of the noise that fear would have added to the problem. She had sent 3 unarmed first-years directly toward the doors these 3 had just come through. They weren't wearing coveralls anymore. Whatever cover they'd used to walk onto Vantage, visitor credentials, contractor badges, she'd find out later, if there was a later that involved paperwork, had been shed the moment the first blade went in. The lead one was a Gorath, tribal armored, easily 2.5 meters of muscle and boiled leather plating with a haft weapon strapped across his back that he had not yet bothered to draw, because he did not yet believe he would need it. Behind him came something small and fast and blue-black, chitinous, low to the ground on 4 limbs with 2 more folded high and bladed. Ithil, a species Iris had studied in xenobiology and never once expected to meet in a hallway. And behind both of them, unhurried, watching rather than advancing, a slate-purple figure in a long dark coat that was cut like a Corvin administrator's but worn like a man who had never sat behind a desk in his life. Dreeth Kaur did not introduce himself. Iris would learn his name later, from other mouths, in a report that would not use the word mercy anywhere in its 400 pages. Right now he was simply the one who wasn't rushing, the one whose eyes went past her, once quick and professional, to check the 3 fallen wing door cadets down, but breathing, shoved clear rather than hurt, because the Gorath had swept them aside like furniture rather than kill children who weren't the assignment, and then came back to her with an expression Iris recognized immediately, because she had seen it on faces her whole life, on instructors and rivals and once. A very large predator in a Harrow's Reach Canyon that had made the same mistake. He was recalculating. "You're supposed to be the scholarship case," he said, in accented but perfectly clear trade tongue, almost conversational, the way a man might comment on whether he hadn't expected. "Orphan colonist. Combat marks adequate, not exceptional. That's the file." "Wrong file," Iris said. It came out flat. Not a boast, not a threat, a correction. The same tone she'd have used to tell a lab partner they'd mislabeled a sample. She was already moving her weight back onto the balls of her feet, already reading the Gorath's shoulders, already counting exits again because that math never stopped just because the number of people trying to kill her had gone from 1 to 4. The Ithil scout broke first. It came low and fast along the floor, faster than anything with that mass should move, blade limbs unfolding with a sound like a knife drawn across ceramic, and Iris did the only thing that made sense against something built to attack ankles and undersides. She went up, not out, planting one boot on the edge of a locker alcove, and driving off it sideways so the scout's rush passed through the space where her legs had been a half-second before. She came down on its trailing limb with her full weight, heard something crack that wasn't bone exactly, more like a chitin joint giving way under a load it hadn't evolved for, and the Ithil shrieked, a high compressed sound, and thrashed sideways into the corridor wall hard enough to leave a crack in the composite. It didn't get back up in a way that mattered. That left the Gorath, who had, in the time it took his scout to fail, finally drawn the haft weapon off his back, a long, curved blade on a pole, built for a species that fought at range with reach and weight rather than speed, and Dreeth Kaur, who still hadn't moved, and somewhere down the spindle, the alarm Iris had been waiting for since the first camera went dark, because a station this size did not run silent for long. A klaxon began to cycle, low and rising, and the wing doors at the far end sealed with a pneumatic hiss that told her someone in a security office 3 decks up had finally noticed a hallway going dark on their board. Good, Iris thought, distant and cold, the way she thought most things now. Somebody's watching. The Gorath came at her like weather, no feints, no economy, just mass and reach and a blade meant to end a fight in one committed arc. And Iris didn't try to match his strength, because matching a Gorath's strength was a category error. The kind of mistake that got cadets killed in the joint species sparring rings twice a term until the instructors drilled it out of them. She matched his timing instead. She let the arc come, tracked its full radius in the half-second she had, and stepped into the dead space at the top of the swing where the blade's momentum had already committed past the point where he could redirect it, and put her elbow into the side of his throat with everything her hips could give it. It didn't drop him. Goreth didn't drop from one strike. She'd read that in the same xenobiology notes Ilan Vosk had probably slept through. But it bought her the half-second she needed, and she used it, driving 2 fast strikes into the gap under his ribs where the boiled leather plating didn't quite meet, watching his weight shift wrong, watching the blade start its second arc a half-beat slower than the first because his body had noticed damage his pride hadn't caught up to yet. "Enough," Deathworld said. It wasn't a shout. That was the thing Iris would remember afterward, when she had time to remember things in order rather than as one long continuous present tense. He never raised his voice, not once, the whole time, and that had unsettled her more than the blade had, because it meant he thought he still had time to be calm. The Goreth didn't stop. Whatever Dreath was to him, employer, handler, something in between, the big warrior was past listening, blood committed now, swinging the haft blade in a low sweep meant to take her legs out from under her rather than kill cleanly, the move of a man who had decided humiliation would do if death was proving difficult. Iris didn't step back from it. Stepping back gave him room to recover his balance for a third swing, and a third swing from something that size was a bet she didn't need to take. She stepped into it instead, inside the arc again, closer than any sane person stood to a moving blade, and used both hands on his extended forearm to redirect the weapon's own weight past her hip and down into the decking, where the pole cracked against alloy hard enough to jar it loose from his grip. Then she hit him. Not the throat again, he'd have braced for that. She put her whole weight, hips and shoulder, and the flat of her forearm, into the side of his knee, the one joint on a 2.5-meter frame that had never once in his life needed to be defended, because nothing his size had ever made him defend it before. He went down like a building coming off its foundations, and this time he stayed down, one hand clawing uselessly at the decking, breath coming in the short, shallow, disbelieving pulls of someone whose body had just informed him, with no negotiation available, that the fight was over. The corridor went very quiet. The klaxon kept cycling. Somewhere behind the sealed wing doors, Iris could hear raised voices, security or students. She couldn't tell which yet, and it didn't matter yet, because the only person still standing across from her, unhurt, uninvolved, still hadn't moved from the spot he'd claimed at the start. Deathworld looked at the Ithil scout crumpled against the wall. He looked at the Goreth on the floor, breath rasping, knee bent at an angle it hadn't been built to bend. He looked last at Iris, standing in the middle of a hallway with her bag still slung over one shoulder, her breathing even, no blade in her hand because she had never needed one, and something in his face, professional, unhurried, certain of the file he'd been handed, finally, quietly, began to come apart. "You're not scholarship," he said again, softer this time almost to himself. "No," Iris said, "I'm not." She didn't move toward him. She didn't need to. Whatever came next, he was going to have to bring it to her, and for the first time since the maintenance cart, she watched him hesitate. He didn't bring it himself. Iris understood, watching the small flicker of his eyes toward the ceiling grate above the alcove lockers, that Deathworld was not a man who fought when the math had turned against him. He was a man who adjusted the math. "Ilan," he said, quiet not to her, "seal the wing doors from the inside, all of them. Nobody in Corridor 7 gets help until we're done." A voice answered from a small calm bead at his collar, dry and precise, 4 syllables clipped short in a way that made Iris think of a species built for close, careful work. Already rooted, securities locked out of the local grid for 90 seconds. "Dreath, that's not the scholarship girl's file." Pull her record again. Her intake physical flagged a threat class marker I've never seen cleared for cadet admission. I know what I'm looking at, Ilan, Dreeth said, and something in his voice had gone tighter, a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. Get the second team to the Spindle's East Junction. Now. Iris used the 90 seconds. She didn't wait for his second team to arrive on schedule, because waiting was a gift she had no reason to give him, and she crossed the distance between them at a dead sprint, the instant his attention flicked back toward his comm bead. 3 strides, 4, closing what had been 10 meters of hallway before he'd finished the sentence he was giving Ilan. Dreeth Core was fast. She'd give him that later, in the flat accounting she did of everything after it was over. He was faster than the Gorath, faster than the Scout, trained in a way that suggested this wasn't his first contract and wouldn't have been his last. He got a forearm up in time to turn her first strike aside, gave ground smoothly instead of taking it, put a locker alcove between them with an economy of movement that told her he'd done this exact thing. The retreat that wasn't a retreat, the fight that bought time rather than won it, more times than she'd had hot meals. Ilan, he said again, breathing harder now but still not raising his voice, I need that junction sealed. The East Junction doors, 40 meters up the spindle, didn't seal. What came through them, instead, was Tessely Orn, maroon, mottled gray, her 4 manipulator limbs spread wide in the boneless defensive posture her species used when frightened and refusing to run anyway, flanked by 2 security cadets in half-donned response gear who'd clearly been closer than any professional plan should have accounted for. Tessely's soft, round eyes found Iris across the length of the corridor, found the Gorheth on the floor, found Dreeth Core with his back to a locker alcove, and did not do the sensible thing, which would have been to run. Iris, she called, and started toward her at a dead run. Tess, stay back. Dreeth Core moved. It happened too fast for Iris to close the distance in time, and she understood in the single cold second it took that this was the one calculation he'd made correctly all day, that a target who would step inside a blade for herself would move differently, would move worse for someone else. He didn't go for Iris. He came off the locker alcove low and hard, and put himself directly into Tessely's path, one clawed hand catching the maroon cadet's foremost limb and wrenching it sideways with a wet, tearing sound that Iris would hear again at 3 in the morning for longer than she wanted to admit. And Tessely went down hard, screaming in a high, wet register that had nothing performative in it at all. Something in Iris's chest changed temperature for the first time since the maintenance cart. It didn't get hot. It got colder and very, very precise. She didn't shout. She didn't run at him blind. She closed the distance at the same even pace she'd used the whole fight, because rage that changed your feet was rage that got you killed, and she had promised herself a long time ago, on a moon that punished exactly that mistake, that she would never make it. Dreeth Core saw her coming and understood correctly that the conversation had ended. He drew a sidearm from beneath the long coat, the first weapon that had appeared all fight that was an edged, small mat, the kind of compact energy pistol built for close work rather than range. And Iris registered it the way she registered everything now, as a data point rather than a threat, because a gun in a hallway this narrow, at this range, against a target already inside your reach, was a decision made by someone who had run out of better options. She was already past the muzzle's arc before it finished coming up. She caught his wrist with both hands, drove it up and wide, felt the weapon discharge once into the ceiling in a bright, silent line that scorched a black stripe across the alloy and dropped a rain of dust and cable insulation over both of them. And then she did to his wrist exactly what she'd done to the Gorath's knee, found the joint, found the angle it had never been asked to defend, and broke it. The pistol clattered to the decking. Dreeth Core made a sound he had clearly not intended to make, sharp and involuntary, and for the first time all afternoon, he looked at her the way the others had looked at her from the very start. Ilan, he said, and his voice had finally lost its calm. Second team now, I don't care what the grid says. The calm bead answered him with a burst of interference and nothing else. Because Iris had already reached up with her free hand and torn it off his collar, and crushed it once under her boot heel. And the corridor, for one full breath, held nothing but the klaxon and Tessely's ragged crying 2 locker alcoves down, and Deathworld's own breathing, uneven now. A professional discovering in real time that the file he'd been given had lied to him about the only thing that mattered. Who hired you? Iris said. It wasn't a demand. It came out flat, procedural, the same tone she'd used on Ilan Vosk that morning. A question asked once, by someone who expected an answer because the alternative outcome had already been demonstrated twice today. Deathworld's eyes went past her down the corridor, to the sealed wing doors that had just, with a heavy pneumatic groan, begun to override themselves open from the far side security, finally breaking through Ilan's 90-second lockout, and something in his face shifted from calculation to a kind of professional resignation, the look of a man deciding which loss to take. He didn't answer her question. He ran. Not toward the second team he'd been calling for, and not toward the wing doors where the first uniforms were now visible, boots pounding, voices raised in the clipped cadence of a real response finally arriving. He went for the maintenance cart's original exit, the one that had never opened onto the concourse at all, Iris understood now, but onto a service stairwell that dropped 3 decks toward the station's cargo ring. A fallback route planned before any of this started, because a professional this careful didn't walk into an ambush without one. Iris looked at Tessely, curled around her ruined limb with the 2 security cadets now kneeling over her, one already keying a medical channel on his sleeve unit, competent, present, doing the job. She looked at the Gorath, still down, still breathing, going nowhere. She looked at the Ithil scout, unconscious against the cracked wall. She looked last at the stairwell door swinging shut on Deathworld's retreating back, and made the only decision that had ever made sense to her in a moment like this. She went after him. The service stairwell smelled of ozone and recycled air, narrow enough that Deathworld's longer legs should have carried him clear of her within a single flight, and for the first 30 seconds they did. She heard his boots 2 turns below her, fast and uneven now with the pain of a broken wrist he was refusing to let slow him, and she took the stairs 3 at a time with a flat, economical stride that had nothing showy in it, because showy was a way of dying on stairs. By the second landing she'd closed half the gap. A maintenance drone rolled out of a service alcove on the 3rd landing, low and boxy on tracked wheels, its warning lights cycling amber as it trundled directly across the stairwell's narrow, midlanding on some pre-programmed inspection route that had never once accounted for a foot chase happening around it. Deathworld shouldered past it without slowing, clipping its housing hard enough to send it spinning into the rail with a shriek of scraping metal, and Iris cleared it the only way the width of the landing allowed, planting one hand on the drone's flat top, and vaulting the rest of the obstacle rather than losing the half-second it would have cost to go around. She landed the far side already running, breath even, the gap between them narrowing another meter for the trouble. The stairwell door at the bottom didn't open onto cargo ring the way she expected. It opened onto a service mezzanine instead, a narrow catwalk over a hangar-sized freight bay stacked 3 stories with containment crates and idle loader drones, sodium work lights casting long yellow shadows across gantry rails, and Deathworld was already 10 meters along the catwalk, favoring his broken wrist against his ribs, when a voice Iris hadn't heard yet, dry, precise, unhurried in a very different register than Death's had been, spoke from a maintenance alcove built into the mezzanine wall. "You made it further than I expected." Iris stopped at the top of the catwalk stairs. The speaker stepped out of the alcove unhurried, and she understood immediately why the voice on Death's comm bead had sounded like careful, close work. The figure had 4 arms, two folded across a narrow chest, and two hanging loose at its sides, pale gray skin patterned in fine geometric ridges, and eyes that tracked her with the specific, unblinking attentiveness of someone who had already run every calculation twice and was now simply confirming them against reality. Vasilen Threnody, it's she, Iris decided from the cadence said, inclining her head with a courtesy that felt more clinical than polite. I handle logistics for Dreeth's contracts. I don't fight. I want that understood before anything else happens on this catwalk, because I would greatly prefer to survive this afternoon. Then you'll want to answer a question, Iris said. Behind Vasilen, Dreeth Kor had stopped retreating, breathing hard, one hand braced against a gantry rail, watching this exchange with the wary stillness of a man who had run out of runway and was hoping someone smarter than him had a plan. Who hired the contract? Iris said. Same flat tone. Same question twice now in two different corridors on two different decks, and she was aware distantly that she was not going to ask a third time in a voice this patient. Vasilen's four hands moved in a small, precise gesture, not surrender, not threat, something closer to a shrug translated through an anatomy that didn't naturally shrug. That information is worth considerably more than my life is worth to Dreeth right now, which tells you everything you need to know about how this afternoon is likely to end for me either way. I'll trade it. Let me leave this mezzanine, and I'll tell you a name. No trades. Then I'll tell you anyway, Vasilen said, because you're going to catch me regardless, and I would rather be the one who volunteered. That, Iris thought, was the first genuinely intelligent thing anyone in this ambush had done all day. The unbroken line, Vasilen said. A faction inside the Corvin delegation to the Joint Academy Oversight Board. They've spent 2 terms building a case that human cadets destabilize joint species training cohorts, cite injury statistics, cite the reflex lag trial numbers, the ones you broke this morning, incidentally, which did not help your case with them. They needed one incident. One human cadet, killed or maimed by gang violence inside academy walls, ugly enough to force a review, clean enough that nobody traces it back to a funding line. You were selected 11 days ago. Speaker Anieth Carr signed the transfer that paid for this. Behind her, footsteps more than one set, moving fast, the second team Dreeth had been calling for, finally arriving from a service junction further along the mezzanine, 3 of them, scarred by the low fast gate Iris was starting to recognize, weapons already drawn. Vasilen looked past Iris at them, and for the first time in the whole exchange, something that might have been genuine irritation crossed the ridged gray face. You're 9 minutes late, she said to the newcomers, in the same dry tone she'd used on Iris. The contract has failed. I would strongly suggest a withdrawal, but I doubt anyone's paying you enough to listen to logistics right now. They weren't. Iris read that in the first half-second, 3 scarn in mismatched tactical gear, professional but not calm, professional but rattled by a comm channel that had gone dead, and a mission timeline that had blown past every checkpoint, and rattled professionals made worse decisions than calm ones, which was the only mercy this whole afternoon had offered her so far. She didn't wait for them to organize. 3 against 1 favored numbers only if the 3 had time to use them, and she took that time away from them the same way she'd taken it from everyone else in Corridor 7, by closing distance, before anyone had finished deciding what closing distance would mean. The catwalk was narrow, which she used. It meant they couldn't come at her 3 wide, had to funnel single file along the gantry rail, and the lead one, younger than Dreeth, faster, unscarred in a way that told her he hadn't done this particular job many times, swung a short baton blade at her head in an arc built for open ground rather than a meter-wide catwalk, and clipped the gantry rail on the backswing hard enough to throw his balance a half-second out of rhythm. A half-second was enough. It was always enough with her. She took the opening he'd handed her, put a heel into the side of his knee the way she had with the Gorath, felt him go down against the rail with a strangled shout, and used his falling weight as a brace to launch herself into the second one before he'd finished raising his own weapon. The third one ran. She let him, chasing a fleeing man across an open freight bay when she still had Deathworld and his logistics officer standing on the same catwalk, was a trade she wasn't willing to make. And besides, she registered this distantly, filing it for later. A man running back the way he'd come would run directly into whatever response team had finally gotten Vantage security moving. That left 3 people on the catwalk who mattered. Herself, breathing hard now for the first time all afternoon, not from exhaustion but from the accumulated cost of every strike she'd had to fully commit to. Vasil and Threnody, 4 arms still folded, watching the whole exchange with the detached professional interest of someone grading an exam. And Deathworld, wrist broken, ribs favored, weaponless, backed against the gantry rail at the catwalk's far end with nowhere left to retreat to. "You have a choice most of your colleagues didn't get today," Iris said, walking toward him at the same even pace she'd used since Corridor 7. "You can be conscious when station security arrives, or you cannot be. I don't care which." Deathworld looked at her for a long moment. Whatever calculation he'd been running his whole professional life, the file, the odds, the calm certainty that had let him stand still in a hallway while his team did the work, she watched it finish collapsing behind his eyes, replaced by something much older and much simpler, the recognition every predator eventually reached when it met something further up the chain than it had accounted for. "The file said orphan," he said, quiet now, almost bewildered. "Colonist stock, adequate marks, it didn't say." "It didn't say deathworlder," Iris finished for him, and there was no heat in it, no triumph, just the same flat correction she'd have given anyone working from bad data. "Your employer should have paid for a better file." He came at her anyway. She would think about that afterward too. In the report she'd have to give 3 times to 3 different offices. That even at the end, even broken and outnumbered and out of options, Deathworld had chosen to finish the job rather than surrender to it. Some professional pride or professional fear driving him off the rail one last time. A clumsy one-handed lunge that had none of the economy his earlier movements had carried. Iris ended it the way she'd have ended a training exercise against a cadet 3 terms behind her, cleanly, without cruelty, without wasted motion. A step off the line of his lunge, a hand on his collar to redirect his own momentum, a sweep of her leg that put him face down against the catwalk decking with his one good arm pinned behind him, before he'd finished registering that the lunge had failed. He didn't get up again. Vasil and Threnody hadn't moved from her spot by the maintenance alcove through any of it, 4 arms still folded, watching with the same unblinking attentiveness. And when Iris finally looked up at her, breathing hard, one knee still on Deathworld's spine, the HFY inclined her head again in that same clinical, courteous gesture. "For what it's worth," Vasil said, "I did tell him to pull your record twice." Station security reached the mezzanine 90 seconds later, 6 of them in hard armor with weapons up, shouting instructions in overlapping voices that Iris obeyed without argument, hands visible. Step back from the detainee, kneel, all of it. Because she had never once in her life needed to be told twice that the people arriving with guns after a fight weren't always able to tell, in the first 30 seconds, who had started it. She knelt on the catwalk decking with her hands laced behind her head, while a Corvin security sergeant secured zip restraints around Deathworld's good wrist, and a second officer did the same, more carefully, to Vasil and Threnody, who offered no resistance at all, and if anything, seemed to find the entire process mildly interesting. "She's the victim," Vasil said, unprompted, to the sergeant cuffing her. "For your report, Deathworld and I were contracted to kill her. We failed. You'll want a full statement from me before anyone decides otherwise, and you'll want it recorded, because I intend to be very thorough." The sergeant looked at Iris, 19 years old, kneeling calmly on a catwalk with a broken freight bay light flickering somewhere behind her, no weapon anywhere near her. 3 attackers down 2 decks up and 2 more restrained on the platform in front of her, and made the correct call in under 5 seconds, which Iris filed away, later, as one of the few pieces of good news the whole afternoon had offered. "Cadet Calder," the sergeant said, lowering his weapon. "Stand down, you're clear." The walk back up through the service stairwell took longer than the descent had. Iris's hands had started shaking somewhere around the second landing, not from fear. She'd tell the counselor this later and mean it. But from the plain biological cost of every strike she'd committed her full weight behind in the last 11 minutes, a bill her body had been deferring while there was still work to do and was now, with nothing left to fight, presenting in full. Corridor 7 was full of people by the time she reached it. Medical staff worked over Tessely Orne on a low grav stretcher, her ruined limbs stabilized and sealed under a translucent brace. The Maroon cadet's round eyes finding Iris across the crowded hallway and holding there, wet but steady, before a medic gently turned her head back and murmured something about staying still. The Gorhath and the Ithil scout were already gone, wheeled out ahead of her under heavier guard than Tessely's, restraints on both despite the extent of their injuries, which told Iris that whatever picture security was building of the last 11 minutes, they'd built it accurately. Ilan Vosk stood near the sealed wing doors with his 2 shadows, uncharacteristically silent, his slate-purple face gone a shade paler than Iris had ever seen it. He didn't say anything to her as she passed. He didn't need to. She watched him look at the scorch mark on the ceiling, at the dented locker alcove, at the cracked composite wall where the Ithil scout had hit hard enough to leave a print, and watched something behind his eyes rearrange itself the way Dreathcores had, on the catwalk, in the last few seconds before the fight went out of him. Commandant Rake found her 20 minutes later, in a side room off the medical bay where a station physician had already cleared her of anything worse than bruised knuckles and a hairline strain in one wrist that Iris hadn't noticed until someone pointed a scanner at it. Rake was Corvin, older than Ilan Vosk's family by 2 generations at least, gray shading the deep violet of her scalp crest, and she had run Meridian Vantage's Joint Officer Program for 11 years with a reputation, among cadets, for never once raising her voice, which Iris had always privately respected, and now, sitting in a paper medical gown with her hands still faintly trembling, found she understood on a much more specific level. "Cadet Calder," Rake said, taking the room's single other chair without being asked, folding her hands in her lap in a gesture that looked almost identical to Vasil Threnity's, though Iris doubted the commandant would appreciate the comparison. "I've had a preliminary statement from your logistics prisoner. I'd like yours when you're able to give it. There's no urgency tonight if you need it." "I'm able now," Iris said. She gave it clean, the way she'd give a range report, sequence, timing, decisions, no embellishment, no editorializing about how she'd felt at any given moment, because how she'd felt wasn't data the commandant needed and wasn't a subject Iris particularly wanted to spend time inside right now. Rake listened without interrupting, occasionally tapping a note into the slate balanced on her knee, and when Iris reached the mezzanine, the name Vasilin had given her, the commandant's tapping stopped entirely. "Speaker Anieth Kar," Rake repeated quiet. "That's the name I was given. You understand what that name means, inside this institution." "I understand he sits on the oversight board that reviews the Joint Academy's admission standards," Iris said. "I understand that makes this complicated in a way that has nothing to do with what happened in that corridor." Rake looked at her for a long moment, and something in the older woman's face, not quite a smile. Corvin didn't smile the way humans did, but something adjacent to it, a loosening around the eyes, settled into place. "You're very calm for someone who was ambushed by 4 professionals 2 hours ago," Rake said. "I grew up somewhere that didn't leave room for the other option," Iris said, and left it there, because it was true, and because it was as much of her history as she owed anyone in a paper gown at 7 in the evening. Rake nodded slowly, made one more note, and rose from her chair. Rest tonight. Full statement in the morning, recorded, formal. Vasil and Threnody has already requested to give hers alongside yours, which is either the most useful cooperation I've ever had from a hostile witness or the opening move of something considerably more complicated. I intend to find out which before this becomes anyone's problem but mine. She paused at the door, one hand against the frame, and looked back at Iris with an expression that had gone, briefly, unguarded. For what it's worth, Cadet Calder, Cadet Orn is stable. The limb will regenerate fully within the term, and the two hostiles who arrived after you left Corridor 7 have both, independently, in separate rooms, described the fight in terms I have never once heard used about a first-year cadet in 11 years running this program. What terms? Iris asked, mostly out of tired curiosity rather than any real desire to know. Rake considered the question for a moment, the way she considered everything, and answered it with the flat, procedural honesty Iris was coming to recognize as the Commandant's own version of the same coldness she carried herself. They said it stopped being a hallway. By morning the story had already changed shape twice, and Iris hadn't said a single new word to make it happen. She learned this from Sergeant Callum Boyd, who found her at the maintenance dock behind the officer dormitories a full hour before her formal statement was scheduled, because Boyd had a habit of finding cadets exactly where they didn't expect to be found, and an even older habit of knowing things 11 hours before the official channels caught up. He was human, 70-some years old, built low and solid the way men got who'd spent decades doing physical work instead of desk work, with a face weathered the color of old rope, and a limp in his left leg that he'd never once explained to any cadet who asked. He ran facilities maintenance for the entire wing, which meant, in practice, that he ran the parts of Meridian Vantage that the official org chart pretended didn't need running. "They're saying gang violence," Boyd said, without preamble, setting 2 mugs of something dark and unofficial down on the workbench between them. "Rival cadet factions. Human aggression problem. There's already a press release drafted with your name misspelled in it on purpose, so if it leaks nobody official has to admit they wrote it." "That's not what happened." "I know that, you know that. 4 bodies down 2 decks up know that too. One of them well enough he asked to talk without a lawyer present, which tells you he's more scared of somebody else than he is of you." Boyd took a long pull from his own mug and studied her over the rim of it with an expression she recognized, distantly, as the same one her father used to wear watching weather roll in over the Harrow's Reach ridgelines. "Question is whether the truth gets there before the story does. In my experience on a station like this, it rarely does on its own. Somebody's got to carry it." "That's not my job." "No," Boyd agreed. "It's not. Your job yesterday was staying alive, and you did that job better than anybody I've heard of doing it in a long career of hearing about people doing it. Today's a different job, and nobody's going to hand it to you nice and labeled. You'll just find yourself standing in a room where it needs doing, same as yesterday." He drained the mug. "You did fine yesterday. You'll do fine today. Go on, Rake's waiting on you, and she's not a patient woman when politics is eating her schedule." She was not, as it turned out, patient at all. The formal statement room was smaller than Iris expected. A recording booth off the administrative wing with a single table, 4 chairs, and a status light that clicked from amber to green the moment she sat down. Commandant Rake was already seated, along with a station legal officer Iris didn't recognize, and, to her genuine surprise, Vasil and Threnody, restraints still on her wrists but seated at the same table rather than behind glass, her four-armed posture as unbothered as it had been on the catwalk. "She insisted," Rake said, before Iris could ask. "Her legal counsel advised against it in writing. She overruled him twice. I'm inclined to let her, because everything she's told us in the last 12 hours has checked out against the physical evidence, which is more than I can say for the statement that arrived from the Corvin delegation an hour ago." "What statement?" Iris asked. The legal officer answered, sliding a slate across the table with a document already open, dense formal language, delegation letterhead, the kind of careful phrasing that took a team of people all night to construct. A formal request that Cadet Calder be placed on administrative suspension pending review of what the delegation is calling a disproportionate response to a hazing incident. It cites your reflex lag trial results yesterday morning as evidence of what it terms threat profile concerns, warranting a fitness reassessment. Iris read it once slowly and felt the same cold precision settle over her that had carried her through the corridor the day before. "Hazing incident," she repeated. "Their framing," Rake said, "not mine. And it will not survive contact with Cadet Threnodi's testimony, which I intend to enter into record in the next hour, along with a formal notice to the delegation that we are aware of the funding trail behind yesterday's contract. But I want you to understand something before we go any further, Cadet Calder, because I think you're the kind of person who'd rather hear it plainly than have it managed around you." "Go ahead." "Speaker Anieth Carr is on this station," Rake said. "He arrived 40 minutes ago, citing diplomatic standing, requesting a personal audience with me before any formal record is entered. I've agreed to it, on the condition that you and Cadet Threnody are both present. I want him to say whatever he intends to say in a room with the two people who can immediately tell me if he's lying." Vasilen's ridged gray face turned toward Rake with something that, on a human, would have been a raised eyebrow. "That's either extremely clever or extremely reckless, Commandant." "It's both," Rake said. "Welcome to running this program." Speaker Anieth Carr arrived exactly on schedule, which Iris would later understand as entirely characteristic of the man. Nothing about him was improvised, not his entrance, not the measured pace of his walk into the small recording room, not the careful, sympathetic angle he held his slate-purple face at as he took the room's fifth chair, a posture calibrated for exactly the kind of hidden recording device he had to assume was running. "Commandant Rake," he said, inclining his head with a courtesy so smooth it barely registered as performance. "Thank you for accommodating an old man's concerns on short notice. And this," his eyes moved to Iris, held there a beat longer than politeness required, professionally unreadable, "must be Cadet Calder. I'm relieved to see you well. Yesterday's incident was, by every account I've received, deeply distressing." "It was," Iris said, "for the 4 people who tried to kill me." Something flickered behind Anieth Carr's eyes, not surprise, she thought, watching him the way she'd watched the Goreth's shoulders, the way she watched everything now. Recalculation. The same look Dreithkor had worn on the catwalk, arriving faster on a man who'd clearly built his whole career on never letting it show. "A tragic hazing incident that escalated beyond anyone's intention, I understand," Anieth Carr said smoothly. "Which is precisely why I've come, not to assign blame, Commandant, but to propose a path that spares this institution a much larger controversy. A quiet administrative resolution." Cadet Calder takes a term's leave, citing the trauma of the incident, entirely understandable given the circumstances. The delegation withdraws its inquiry into the Academy's admission standards. Everyone involved is spared a public proceeding that would, frankly, do none of us any favors, least of all Cadet Calder, whose reflex lag results yesterday have already generated considerable, and I'd suggest unhelpful, attention. "You're offering to make this go away," Rake said, flat, "in exchange for my removing a student who was the target of an assassination contract you funded." The word landed in the small room like a dropped weight. Anieth Carr didn't flinch, Iris gave him that. Whatever else the man was, he had a genuinely remarkable capacity to hold his own face still. But something in the careful angle of his posture shifted a fraction, the first crack in 11 minutes of flawless composure. That is a serious accusation, Commandant, and I would remind you that it carries significant diplomatic weight if made without. Vasil and Threnody, Rake said, would you care to speak to the funding trail you described in your statement this morning? The Ashvin's forearms unfolded slightly, an economical gesture of readiness rather than aggression, and she looked directly at Speaker Anieth Carr with an expression that held, for the first time since Iris had met her, something that might genuinely have been satisfaction. 11 days ago, Vasilin said, a transfer of 400,000 standard credits moved from a shell account registered to a shipping concern on Corvath Reach into an operational account Dreathcore, and I have used for 3 prior contracts. I have the account chain, the timestamps, and a recorded call in which the individual authorizing the transfer identified Cadet Calder by name, described her academic record in detail consistent with restricted admissions files, and specified that the incident needed to, and I quote, read as internal cadet violence, not external action. I would be delighted to play the recording for the room, Speaker, if you'd like to confirm the voice yourself. The silence that followed was the longest Iris had experienced since Corridor 7, and considerably colder. Rake let it stretch a full 10 seconds before she spoke again, unhurried, the way she'd let every silence in this proceeding do its own work rather than filling it herself. You'll understand, Speaker, that I have spent 11 years building a program on the premise that this station's neutral ground actually means something, that a cadet from any world, Deathworld or otherwise, can walk these corridors without a hidden faction on my own oversight board deciding her admission, represents a threat worth eliminating rather than a policy worth debating openly. I intend to spend whatever remains of my tenure here ensuring that premise survives what you tried to do to it. I'd suggest you spend whatever remains of yours considering how thoroughly you've undermined it instead. You have no standing to lecture me on neutral ground, Commandant, Anieth Carr said, and for the first time his voice carried an edge that hadn't been there a minute earlier, thin and brittle under the careful diplomatic polish. This academy admitted a species classified, by every legitimate threat assessment this delegation has ever commissioned, as an active hazard to cohort safety, and called it progress. I did not build the fear that drove today's outcome. I simply refuse to pretend it away the way the rest of this board has, for 2 terms, while cadets from a dozen more fragile species shared mess halls and sparring rings with something the wider galaxy has spent a generation learning to be afraid of. Then you should have brought that argument to the board, Rake said, in the open, on the record, where it could be tested by people equipped to test it. Instead, you brought hired blades into a hallway full of children. Whatever fear you're carrying, Speaker, it doesn't excuse the shape you chose to give it. Anieth Carr recovered his composure faster than Iris expected, which told her something about how many times in his career he'd needed to. A recording, he said, proves nothing without corroborating provenance, and I would remind everyone in this room that Cadet Threnody is a paid criminal with every incentive to name a scapegoat wealthy enough to make her sentence disappear. I came here in good faith, Commandant, to protect this institution from exactly this kind of manufactured. The legal aide seated at his left hand, Corvin, younger, quiet through the entire exchange. A slate balanced on her knee, the way junior staff carried them everywhere, moved. It wasn't much. That was, afterward, the thing everyone in the room agreed on when they gave their separate accounts. It wasn't a lunge, wasn't a shout, was in fact almost nothing at all. A single smooth motion of one hand toward the slate's underside where something had been fitted that didn't belong to any standard-issue recording device Iris had ever seen, flat, dark, no larger than a coin, already rotating toward Vasil and Threnady's exposed throat with the particular unhurried confidence of a tool built for exactly one silent job. Iris was out of her chair before the slate finished turning. She didn't go for the device. There wasn't time to identify it cleanly enough to know how to disarm it without triggering whatever it did, and she had learned, on a moon that didn't forgive that kind of gamble, to remove the hand instead of arguing with the weapon. She caught the aide's wrist mid-arc, the same clean redirect she'd used a dozen times the day before, and the device skittered from suddenly nerveless fingers to clatter against the recording booth's floor, where it hissed once, a short venomous sound, and went still. The legal officer at the end of the table, the one Iris hadn't yet heard speak, was already moving, weapon drawn from a shoulder holster Iris hadn't clocked until it was in his hand, and for one flat, cold second the small room held every ingredient of Corridor 7 all over again. A weapon, a target, a room full of people who hadn't finished deciding whether to be afraid yet. "Hold," Commandant Rake said. She didn't shout it. She said it the way she said everything, low and level and absolutely certain of being obeyed, and the legal officer, station security, Iris understood a beat later, not delegation staff at all, seated there for exactly this contingency, held his aim steady on the Corvin aide rather than on Iris, which told her Rake had planned for more than one version of this meeting going wrong. The aide didn't resist. She sat very still, wrist still caught in Iris's grip, staring down at the small dark device cooling on the floor tiles with an expression that had gone, in the space of 2 seconds, entirely blank. Speaker Aniethkar had not moved from his chair. He hadn't reached for anything, hadn't shouted an order, hadn't done a single thing that a careful lawyer could later point to as direct evidence of intent. And Iris understood, watching him sit perfectly, composedly still in the wreckage of his own plan, that this too was characteristic. He had not personally raised a hand against anyone in this entire affair. Not against her, not against Tesly, not against Vasilin, and he had clearly believed, right up until the moment his own aide's hand moved, that he never would need to. "That," Rake said, into the silence, her voice carrying the flat weight of someone entering something permanent into a record, was an attempted assassination of a cooperating witness, committed inside a formal statement proceeding, in the presence of the Academy Commandant and station security. I don't believe even your delegation's most generous counsel will manage to frame that as a hazing incident, Speaker." Aniethkar's careful mask held for one more second, and then, quietly, without drama, it didn't. "She acted without my instruction," he said. "She works for you," Rake said. "She sat at your side." And Cadet Threnodi's recording, which your aide just attempted to prevent from ever being verified, at considerable personal risk to herself, which I doubt she took on independent initiative, will be in the hands of the Joint Oversight Board within the hour, alongside a full account of what just happened in this room. She rose from her chair, unhurried, every inch the woman who had run this program for 11 years without raising her voice once, and looked down at the speaker with an expression that held no heat in it at all, only a kind of final, procedural certainty that Iris recognized, with something close to grim satisfaction, as very much her own. "You came here today to negotiate the removal of a 19-year-old cadet who defended herself, and 3 of her classmates against 4 hired killers. I would strongly advise you to spend whatever influence you have left securing legal counsel, rather than attempting, a second time, to negotiate anything with me." Station security took Speaker Aniethkar and his legal aide out through the same recording booth door Dreithkor had used the day before, and this time nobody ran. Vasilin Threnody, still seated, still restrained, looked at the small, cooled device on the floor for a long moment, then up at Iris, who had not yet let go of a wrist that no longer needed holding. "You know," the Ashvin said, in the same dry, precise tone she'd used on the catwalk, "I genuinely believed this morning that cooperating was the smart move purely as a matter of self-preservation. I did not anticipate it would also involve saving my own life a second time in 2 days, from my own employer's staff, in a government building, during a legal proceeding." She tilted her head, the closest thing to a smile her physiology seemed to allow. "You continue to be considerably more than your file suggested," Cadet called her. "Everyone keeps saying that," Iris said, and finally let go of her wrist. The next 4 days moved at a strange, compressed speed, the way time did when most of it happened in rooms Iris wasn't allowed into. The Joint Oversight Board convened an emergency session on the second day, closed to cadets, and by the third day the version of events circulating through Meridian Vantage's public channels had finally, grudgingly, caught up to something resembling the truth. Not the full truth, not yet, but enough of it that the phrase gang violence had quietly disappeared from every official statement, replaced by language about a coordinated external attack currently under joint investigation. Speaker Anieth Carr's diplomatic standing had been suspended pending a formal inquiry, which Boyd told her, over another mug of his unofficial dark drink, was bureaucratic language for they know exactly what he did, and they're deciding how loudly they're allowed to say so. The unbroken line's oversight seats had been quietly vacated, one, by delegates suddenly discovering urgent business elsewhere in the sector. None of it felt like winning. Iris understood, sitting through her second full day of formal debriefs, that this was probably a permanent condition rather than a temporary one. That a fight didn't end when the last blow landed. It just changed shape into paperwork, and the paperwork could take considerably longer to hurt. Tessely Orne was released from the infirmary on the third day, with her limb fully regenerated beneath a thin protective sleeve she'd need to wear for another 2 weeks. And the first thing she did, before returning to her own dormitory, was find Iris in the mess hall and sit down across from her, with the particular, deliberate calm of someone who had rehearsed what she wanted to say, and intended to get through all of it before her nerve failed. "I wasn't going to run," Tessely said. "When you told me to stay back, I want you to know that wasn't fear making me stupid. I made a choice." "I know," Iris said. "I'd have made the same one." "Would you?" Iris considered the question honestly, the way she considered most things, and found she meant the answer she gave. "Yes." Tessely's soft, round eyes held hers for a long moment, and something in the Maroon cadet's boneless posture eased, the tension she'd been carrying through her whole recovery finally, visibly, letting go. "Good," she said, "because I'd like us to keep being the kind of people who make that choice about each other, if it's all the same to you." They ate the rest of the meal in comfortable, unhurried silence, which was, Iris was coming to understand, the closest thing either of them had to a language for what had happened between them in that corridor. It was on the 4th day that Commandant Rake called her into the administrative wing again, and this time the room wasn't a recording booth but Rake's own office, wide windows looking out over Vantage's docking ring, and the Commandant's expression, when Iris took the offered chair, carried a weariness Iris hadn't seen on her before. "The Oversight Board has reached a preliminary finding," Rake said, without preamble. "Speaker Anieth Carr will face formal charges before his own delegation's judiciary, which is, frankly, the harshest outcome I could have hoped for given the diplomatic sensitivities involved. Vasilen Threnity's cooperation has earned her a reduced sentence recommendation, which I understand offends some notion of justice, but has been, without question, the single most useful thing that's happened to this investigation. Dreeth Corps and the 2 hostiles from the Freight Bay face full prosecution." "That sounds like it's over," Iris said. "It's not," Rake said, "and I want to be honest with you about why, because you've earned honesty more than most cadets I've had in this office. There's a faction on the board, smaller now, chastened, but not gone, that still believes the incident, whatever its origin, proves their underlying point. That a cadet capable of what you did in that corridor represents a fitness concern the standard admissions process wasn't designed to screen for. They can't touch you on the assassination attempt. Nobody sane blames a victim for surviving one, but they've requested, and I've been unable to block it entirely, only delay it 4 days, a formal fitness reassessment. A full evaluation, physical and psychological, conducted by an independent joint species panel to determine whether your threat profile is compatible with continued enrollment. Iris felt the old, familiar stillness settle into her chest, the same one that had carried her through Corridor 7, and understood, distantly, that some part of her had been waiting for exactly this since the moment Dreathcore had said the word file. When she said, "Tomorrow morning," Rake said, "I fought for later, I lost. I want you to understand something before you walk into that evaluation hall," Cadet called her, "because I don't think anyone else is going to tell you plainly. This isn't a fair test. It isn't designed to be. It's designed to find a reason, and if you give them the smallest one, a flash of temper, a moment where the cold cracks, they will use it, regardless of what happened to you this week." "It won't crack," Iris said. Rake studied her for a long moment, and something in the older woman's face, tired, careful, and underneath it, Iris thought, something that might have been genuine respect, settled into a decision. "No," Rake said finally, "I don't believe it will. Get some rest tonight. Tomorrow's going to be long." The evaluation hall was a wide, high-ceilinged chamber Iris had only seen once before, during orientation week, when it had been used to demonstrate the kinetics range's full capability to 100 wide-eyed new cadets. It looked different, empty of spectators, and full of instruments instead, biometric rigs along one wall, a reflex lag array recalibrated since her trial 4 days earlier into something with a wider dynamic range, a raised gallery at the far end where, Iris noted without surprise, roughly 30 seats had already filled with observers she hadn't been told would be present. The panel sat behind a long table at the chamber's center. 5 examiners, 5 different species, chaired by a Corvin administrator named Dr. Ashura Vel, whose formal manner reminded Iris uncomfortably of Anieth Carr's, though nothing in the woman's file suggested any connection beyond shared species and shared caution. Dr. Vel opened the session with a description of the day's structure: physical assessment first, psychological evaluation to follow, a joint determination by end of session, in a tone so carefully neutral it managed to convey, without a single accusatory word, exactly how skeptical the panel had arrived. The physical assessment began with the reflex lag array, the same test she'd aced 4 days earlier, except this time the panel had widened its tolerance bands and steepened its difficulty curve, and Iris understood, watching the first sequence load, that this instrument had been recalibrated specifically around her prior result, built, in other words, to find the ceiling that hadn't shown up the first time. She beat it anyway. Not by the same clean margin, the widened range cost her, and she felt the extra strain in her shoulders on the third sequence, a genuine effort rather than the near-effortless pass of 4 days before, but she beat it, and the panel's lead technician frowned at his readout for a long moment before quietly updating a number. "Recalibrate the instrument again," Dr. Vel said, not quite a question. "Doctor," the technician said, carefully, "this is the widened band. There isn't a wider one built into the array's current configuration." "Then build one," Vel said. It took 40 minutes to modify the rig. Iris waited through it in a folding chair at the chamber's edge, aware of the gallery's eyes on her, aware of Ilan Vosk seated near the front. She hadn't expected him to come, hadn't expected the careful, unreadable expression on his slate-purple face as he watched the technician's work, and used the time the way she used every dead space now, running the same flat internal accounting she'd run in Corridor 7. They wanted a crack. She didn't have one to give them. The second reflex sequence, on the modified rig, ran nearly a full second faster in its baseline than the first. Iris beat it by a margin narrow enough that the technician's readout showed her pulse elevated for the first time all morning. Genuine effort, genuine cost. The kind of number that on paper could be spun either as remarkable or as dangerously abnormal, depending entirely on who was doing the spinning. Dr. Vell studied the readout for a long moment, then moved the panel on to load tolerance, a series of endurance stations testing sustained physical output under increasing resistance, the kind of test Iris recognized immediately as designed less to measure capability than to measure what happened when capability finally ran out. 4 separate stations. 4 separate examiners calling for the resistance to be increased past the point where the standard cadet cohort's baseline had ever been tested. Each new escalation met by a technician's cautious glance at Dr. Vell, and each glance answered with the same flat nod. Midway through the second station, a 6th examiner entered the hall unannounced, a specialist Dr. Vell introduced only as an outside consultant retained by the board, a slate-purple Corvin physiologist whose credentials, when Rake quietly checked them from the gallery afterward, traced back to a research contract funded, 2 steps removed, by a foundation with historical ties to the unbroken line. He said little, watching from beside the panel table with a data slate of his own, and requested twice that the resistance curve on the 3rd station be steepened further than even Dr. Vell had originally authorized, citing a need to establish a true outer bound, rather than merely a passing threshold. Vell allowed it both times, though the second request drew a long, unreadable look from her that Iris filed away as the closest thing to protest the chair examiner was willing to offer inside a formal proceeding. Iris didn't argue the steepened curve either. She simply reset her stance, adjusted her grip, and met it because she had understood, somewhere around the second recalibration of the reflex array, that every additional examiner this panel called in was less a test of her capability and more a test of how long the board's harder faction could keep manufacturing reasons before running out of ceiling to raise. By the 3rd station, Iris's arms had begun to shake with genuine fatigue, sweat soaking through her undershirt, every rep costing something real now instead of the near-effortless precision of Corridor 7's opening minutes. She didn't slow the pace. She didn't ask for a break. She kept the same even rhythm she'd used against the Gorath's blade, breath measured, weight distributed, and when the 4th station's resistance climbed past a threshold that made even the lead technician mutter something about equipment tolerances, she finished the set anyway, arms trembling, and set the weighted bar down with the same careful control she'd started with. A ripple moved through the gallery, quiet, but audible 30 observers who had come expecting either a spectacle or a vindication, and were, Iris understood without looking up, getting neither, getting instead the much stranger sight of a 19-year-old girl doing exactly what was asked of her, again and again, without once raising her voice or her temper about it. The psychological evaluation, when it finally began after a short recess, was where Iris had expected the real attempt to come, and she wasn't wrong. The panel's alien evaluator, Ithil, small, precise, entirely unrelated to the scout who'd attacked her in Corridor 7, but close enough in cadence that Iris felt the coincidence land somewhere cold in her chest, walked her through a sequence of scenario prompts designed, transparently, to probe for exactly the crack Rake had warned her about. Describe your emotional state during the confrontation. Describe how you felt when your colleague was injured. Describe what you wanted to do to the man responsible. I wanted him restrained, Iris said to that last one, flat and unhurried. I wanted him unable to hurt anyone else in that corridor. I didn't want anything beyond that. No anger, the evaluator said. No desire for retribution. You expect this panel to believe a 19-year-old felt nothing but clinical calculation while a friend screamed in pain 20 feet away from her. I felt something, Iris said. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. It got colder, not hotter. If your instruments are built to measure heat, doctor, you're going to keep getting readings that don't fit your model because that was never the model I was built on. The evaluator pressed once more, leaning forward slightly over the panel table. Describe, then, what you believe separates cold calculation of the kind you're describing from simple absence of feeling. This panel has evaluated cadets before who reported no emotional register during violence, Cadet Calder, and in every prior case it correlated with a diagnosis this board takes seriously. Convince me your description is different. Ask Cadet Threnody what I did the moment I heard my friend scream, Iris said. I didn't finish the fight efficiently and move on. I changed what I was willing to risk to reach her. I went through a locked door instead of around it. That's not absence of feeling, Doctor. That's feeling channeled somewhere it could actually do something useful, instead of somewhere it would have gotten 3 more people hurt, while I stood in a hallway being loud about how upset I was. You can call that whatever clinical term your board prefers. I call it the only kind of caring that's ever done anyone in my life any real good. A second evaluator, seated further down the panel table, one Iris hadn't heard speak all session, finally leaned toward his microphone. And if this panel rules against you today, and you're removed from this program, do you believe that channel simply closes? That the composure disappears along with the uniform? No, Iris said. It doesn't come from the uniform. It never did. Your board can take the insignia back if it decides to. It can't take back what built it in the first place. And I'd think carefully, Doctor, about whether that's a capability you actually want walking away from this institution unaffiliated, rather than trained, integrated, and answerable to exactly the standards you're currently trying to decide I don't meet. Nobody at the panel table had an immediate answer for that, and the pause that followed carried a different weight than the ones before it. Not hostile now, Iris thought, but genuinely, visibly uncertain. 5 examiners from 5 species quietly recalculating a position they'd walked into this session confident of holding. The evaluator studied her for a long, silent moment, and beside him, Dr. Vell's careful neutral expression finally, almost imperceptibly, shifted not toward warmth, Iris thought, but toward something closer to the recalculation she'd watched cross 4 other faces this week. The specific, quiet arrival of a person confronting data their framework hadn't accounted for. It was the last prompt of the session that Iris would remember most clearly afterward, not because it was the hardest, but because of how simply she was able to answer it. One final question, the evaluator said. If this panel finds against you today, if we determine your threat profile incompatible with continued enrollment, and you're removed from this institution by end of week, what would you do? Iris considered it honestly, the way she considered everything, and found the answer waiting for her already, plain and complete. I'd go home, she said. I'd finish growing up somewhere that already knew what I was, and I'd stop apologizing for it to people who'd never survived a night that required it. I came here to serve, Doctor, not to be forgiven for existing. If your board decides it doesn't want what I am, that's a decision about your institution, not about anything I need to fix in myself. Nobody in the gallery made a sound. Dr. Vell closed her slate, exchanged a long look with the 4 other examiners down the panel table. Iris watched something pass between them without a word being spoken, the particular silent consensus of professionals who had all, independently, arrived at the same uncomfortable place, and rose from her chair. The panel will deliberate, she said, and issue a finding by end of day. It took considerably less than end of day. Iris was still in the locker room off the evaluation hall, forearms wrapped in cold compress, when Commandant Rake found her, and the older woman's expression, this time, held nothing weary in it at all. Full pass, Rake said, unanimous. And a formal note in your file, Dr. Vell insisted on this personally, that the panel found no evidence of instability only, and I'm quoting her exactly, a threshold for composure this institution's standard instrumentation was not designed to measure. A small, dry note entered the commandant's voice, the closest Iris had heard her come to something like humor. I believe that's the nicest thing a fitness review panel has ever written about anyone in this program's history, Cadet Calder. Try not to let it go to your head. She asked to see Deathworld 3 days after the panel's ruling, and the request took a full afternoon of paperwork to clear, because station security had, understandably, developed a set of very specific opinions about who got access to a prisoner awaiting transfer for prosecution. Rake approved it in the end, on the condition that a guard stood inside the room, and Iris suspected, though the commandant never said so directly, that some part of the approval came from a professional curiosity of her own about how the conversation would go. The detention block held Deathworld behind a clear polymer wall, his broken wrist set in a proper brace now. The professional stillness he'd carried through Corridor 7 largely returned, though something in his posture, a looseness in the shoulders that hadn't been there before, told Iris the man she was looking at had shed something in the last week that he wasn't getting back. "I didn't expect a visit," he said, when she took the room's single chair. "I had a question your logistics officer couldn't answer," Iris said. "You could have run the moment the file didn't match what you found in that corridor. Most people would have. You stayed in it anyway, past the point it made sense." Deathworld considered the question for a long moment, and when he answered, there was none of the careful calm he'd carried through the ambush. Just a kind of tired, professional honesty that Iris found she respected more than she'd expected to. 22 years doing this work," he said. "I have never once, not one time, walked into a job and found the target was more dangerous than the file. Every contract I've ever taken has gone the other direction. The target's weaker than promised, or exactly as promised, and the job runs clean. I stayed in that corridor because some part of me refused to believe it could be true. That's not tactics, Cadet Calder. That's pride. It cost me a wrist, a career, and the next several years of my life. And I'd tell any professional who'll listen that it was the worst decision I've ever made and the only honest one." "Who paid Anieth Carr's original contact?" Iris asked. "You said the transfer routed through a shipping concern on Corvath Reach. Was there a name behind that, or did it stop there?" "It stopped there as far as I know," Death said. "I was hired through Vasilen's usual channels, given a file, given a fee. I never spoke to the speaker directly until the recording your friend played back for the panel. I suspect, if you want the honest professional assessment, that he kept it that way on purpose, layers, cutouts, deniability. Men like him build careers on never once touching the thing they've ordered done." "Would you have taken the contract?" Iris asked, "if the file had been accurate, if it had said what I actually was instead of what he wanted you to believe I was?" Deathworld considered the question with the same unhurried care he seemed to bring to everything now, a man with nothing left to protect by lying, and Iris suspected no real appetite left for it either. "No," he said finally. "Not at that price. There are contracts I'd have priced considerably higher, given accurate data, and contracts I'd have declined outright as unprofitable relative to the risk. This one, priced honestly, wasn't worth 4 professionals' lives and my own remaining career. I want you to understand that isn't remorse dressed up as arithmetic, Cadet Calder. It's simply the arithmetic I should have run in the first place, before I let a client's confidence substitute for my own diligence. That's the actual lesson 22 years should have taught me long before last week did." "It's a lesson a lot of people in that corridor learned the hard way," Iris said. "I don't doubt it," Death said, and something almost like a dry, tired humor crossed his reptilian features, the first Iris had seen from him since the ambush. "For what it's worth, I've had considerably more time to sit with mine than most of them will get." Iris nodded slowly, filing that away, and rose to leave. At the door, Deathworld's voice caught her one more time, quieter than anything he'd said in the corridor, or on the catwalk, or in this room. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've spent 22 years believing I understood exactly how dangerous the galaxy could get. I was wrong about a great many things this week, Cadet Calder, but I want it on record that I was wrong about that most of all." She didn't answer that. There wasn't an answer that would have meant anything, and she had learned a long time ago that some silences were more honest than words. Ilin Vosk found her 2 days later, in a stretch of Corridor 7 that had been fully repaired, new composite paneling seamless where the crack had run, a fresh camera housing glowing steady blue overhead. He fell into step beside her the way he always did, and for a long moment neither of them said anything, which was, for Ilin Vosk, an almost unrecognizable kind of silence. "I've been rehearsing this since the panel ruling," he said finally, "and every version I practiced sounded worse out loud than it did in my head, so I'm just going to say it badly and let that be that. I was wrong about you. Not in the small way where I overestimated a test result or underestimated your marks. I built an entire theory of your species around convenience, because it was easier than looking closely, and I dressed it up as xenobiology because that made it sound like scholarship instead of what it actually was." "Which was what?" Iris said, mostly because she suspected he needed to finish the sentence himself. "Fear," Ilin Vosk said, and something in his slate-purple face, for once, held nothing performative in it at all. "I think I've been afraid of what your species represents since my first week here, and it was simpler to mock it than to sit with it. I watched you end 4 professional killers in a hallway without raising your voice once, and the thing that's kept me up since isn't that it happened. It's that I spent a full term calling you fragile." Iris considered several responses, discarded most of them, and settled on the one that felt most true. "You don't have to apologize for being afraid," she said. "Everyone who watched that corridor should have been. I'd worry about the ones who weren't. What matters is what you do with it now." "And what should I do with it?" Vosk asked, and for the first time since she'd met him, the question sounded genuine rather than baited. "Update the file," Iris said, and left him standing in the repaired corridor with that. The formal resolution, when it finally arrived a week later, took the shape of a single terse notice on the Academy's public boards. The Joint Oversight Board had accepted Speaker Anieth Carr's resignation in lieu of a full judiciary proceeding, a resignation that came, according to Boyd's considerably more detailed unofficial account, only after his own delegation's leadership made it clear that continuing to shield him would cost the unbroken line every remaining seat it held. Vasilin Threnodi's cooperation earned her, in the end, a labor sentence rather than a custodial one, served, ironically, doing structural logistics work on the very station she'd tried to have someone killed on. Dreeth Corps and the surviving hostiles from the freight bay faced full prosecution under joint species law, sentences Iris never followed closely enough to remember the exact lengths of, because by the time they were handed down, she had already mostly stopped thinking about the 4 of them at all. What she thought about instead, in the quiet weeks that followed, was Tessely's steady presence across the mess hall table each evening, and the particular way the corridor's new camera housing caught the light differently than the old one had, and the slow, grudging way Ilin Vosk had started actually reading the assigned xenobiology texts instead of skimming them for arguments, and the strange, settled feeling of walking through Corridor 7 twice a day, without her body running its old automatic threat count underneath every step. It took longer than she expected for that particular habit to fade. It never fully did. The story reached further than Meridian Vantage's own bulletin boards within the first week, in the way stories about a colonist teenager surviving a professional assassination contract tended to. Once a Joint Species Academy's press office lost the ability to keep the incident quiet. A sector news service ran a short, factually careful piece under a headline that made Boyd snort into his mug when he showed it to her. Cadet repels coordinated attack. Cooperates fully with investigation. Precise. Unglamorous. Exactly the kind of coverage Iris found she could tolerate without flinching. A second outlet, considerably less careful, ran a version with an image of her Academy portrait beside a lurid reconstruction of Corridor 7 that bore almost no resemblance to what had actually happened there, and Iris made herself read it once, all the way through, before deciding it wasn't worth a second read or a formal complaint. What she hadn't expected was the messages that followed, routed through the Academy's public correspondence office and forwarded to her in a batch 2 weeks after the ruling, dozens of them, from colonists on a handful of frontier Deathworlds scattered across 3 sectors, none of whom she'd ever met, each one short, plainly written, none of them asking for anything. A miner from a radiation-scoured outpost World wrote that his daughter had shown the sector piece to her whole schoolroom. A retired logistics officer from a Moon 2 systems past Harrow's reach wrote simply that he'd read the report twice and recognized, in the flat procedural language of her own statement, the exact cadence his own grandmother had used describing a border skirmish decades gone. None of it asked Iris to be anything other than what she already was. That, more than the sector coverage or the lurid reconstruction or the formal citation rake would eventually read into the record, was the thing that settled something loose in her chest she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying since the maintenance cart first came into view outside a lecture hall door. She answered a handful of the messages herself, in the same plain, unhurried language she used for everything, and left the rest unanswered not out of indifference, but because she'd learned, watching her father field the same kind of unsolicited correspondence after a bad storm season back home, that acknowledging a story didn't require answering every voice that had heard it, only being honest with the ones who mattered enough to keep in reach. She called home for the first time in 6 weeks the night after the panel's ruling reached her file, because it was the kind of news that felt wrong to leave sitting, unspoken across the distance between Meridian Vantage and a moon, most of the galaxy's star charts still listed under its administrative designation rather than its name. Harrow's reach answered on the 3rd ring, her father's face resolving out of calm static in the low orange light of the homestead kitchen, weathered the way Boyd's was weathered, a man built by the same kind of place that had built her. He didn't ask what had happened first. He never did. He asked if she was hurt, and when she told him not badly, he exhaled once slow and let the rest of his questions wait until she was ready to give them in order. She told it to him the way she'd told it to Rake, sequence, timing, decisions, and her father listened without interrupting, the same stillness in his face that Iris recognized as her own, inherited or learned. She'd never been entirely sure which and had stopped needing to know. "You remember the Ridgeback," he said when she finished, "the one that came down into the grain silo doorway when you were 7. "I remember. You asked me that night why I made you stand there and watch instead of pulling you back inside." He shifted in his chair, the calm static crackling faintly around the motion. "I never gave you a real answer. Told you some line about learning the land, and it wasn't a lie exactly, but it wasn't the whole of it either. The whole of it is that I grew up on a world that would have eaten either of us the first year if we hadn't learned, early, that fear makes you slower and stillness makes you fast, and I wanted you to have that in your body before you ever needed it in a crisis, because there's no teaching it in the moment. You either have it already or you don't." "I had it," Iris said. "I know," her father said, and something in his voice, careful and worn and entirely without drama, carried more weight than anything Rake or Dr. Vell or the whole oversight board had managed across 2 weeks of formal proceedings. "I've spent your whole life a little afraid of what that gift was going to cost you someday, girl. Watching you grow up so still that people mistook it for something missing in you, instead of something you were carrying so heavy you'd learn not to let it show. I'm not afraid of that anymore. I watched the footage they finally released. Don't ask how. Boyd's got contacts I don't ask questions about, and what I saw wasn't a girl with something missing. I saw exactly what I raised." Iris didn't have an answer for that, not one that would have survived being spoken over a comm line with 6 seconds of transmission lag between them. So she let the silence hold instead, and her father let her have it, the way he always had, the two of them sitting quiet on either end of a very long distance, until the moment had finished saying what it needed to say without either of them putting words to it. "Your mother wants to know if you're eating," he said finally, and the ordinary domestic weight of the question, after everything, nearly undid the careful composure Iris had carried through 4 days of formal hearings without a crack. "Tell her yes," Iris said, and found, for the first time in 2 weeks, that her voice didn't come out entirely flat when she said it. The Ridgeback story wasn't one she told often, not because it embarrassed her, but because it belonged to a version of her childhood most of her classmates at the Vantage had no frame of reference for, a version where the difference between careful and careless wasn't a grade on a transcript, but a fact your body carried in its muscle memory for the rest of your life. Learned in a grain silo doorway at 7 years old with her father's hand steady on her shoulder, and a predator the size of a transport truck working its way slowly along the herd fence 40 meters away, deciding. He hadn't let her run. That was the part she'd understood only much later, replaying the memory as an adult rather than a frightened child. That running would have triggered the one instinct the Ridgeback couldn't ignore, and stillness, cold and complete and absolutely counter to every animal impulse a 7-year-old's body screamed at her to obey, was the only variable in that doorway either of them had any control over. She had stood there for what felt at the time like the length of a season, watching the Ridgeback's low, armored head swing along the fence line, its breath steaming in the cold morning air, until it finally, without ceremony, turned and moved off toward easier ground. Her father had never told her, in the aftermath, that she'd done well. He'd simply crouched down to her height, looked her in the eye, and said, "You didn't run. That's the whole skill. Everything else is just knowing when to use it." She had carried that lesson through 11 more years on Harrow's Reach, through radiation storms that flattened the homestead's outer fencing twice a season, through a winter when the colony's supply transport failed to arrive for 6 weeks, and every family on the moon learned exactly how much stillness a genuine crisis required, through the slow, unglamorous accumulation of a childhood that had never once offered her the luxury of believing the universe owed her softness. By the time the Vantage's recruitment officer had found her, 17 years old and already the colony's most decorated junior response volunteer, the stillness wasn't a skill anymore. It was simply what was left after everything else had been worn away. She had never explained any of that to Ilan Vosk, or to Dr. Vell's panel, or to the 30 strangers who'd filled the evaluation hall's gallery hoping to see her crack. She hadn't needed to. The corridor had explained it for her, more completely than words ever could have, and she found, in the days after her father's call, a strange and settled peace in that the truest thing about her had finally been demonstrated instead of merely described, in a hallway full of people who would never fully understand what they'd watched, but who would, all of them, remember it. The academy settled back into its ordinary rhythms faster than Iris expected, and slower than she'd hoped, in the particular way institutions did when something had happened inside their walls that the walls themselves hadn't been built to absorb. Applied kinetics resumed the following week in a different lecture hall, a small, unspoken accommodation nobody officially acknowledged, and Iris noticed that cadets from other cohorts had started taking the long way around Corridor 7 rather than through it, even now that the paneling was seamless and the cameras glowed a steady, unbroken blue. She understood it without resenting it. A hallway carried what happened in it longer than the physical repairs suggested, and she had learned, growing up on a moon that kept its own scars visible in the land for years after a bad storm, that pretending otherwise didn't actually make anyone heal faster. What surprised her was who did keep walking through it. Tessie took the direct route every single day, deliberately, her recovered limb moving with the same easy confidence it always had, and when Iris asked her about it, gently, over one of their now regular mess hall dinners, the Maroon cadet gave her a look that carried more steel in it than Iris had given her credit for before Corridor 7. "If I let a hallway win," Tessie said, "then it wasn't really you who stopped them. It was just the building winning eventually on a longer schedule. I'd rather it be the both of us. New cadets arrived at the start of the following term. 40-some fresh faces from a dozen species Iris had grown mostly accustomed to sharing a lecture hall with. And she watched, with a distant, wry amusement she hadn't expected to feel about any of this, how quickly the story of Corridor 7 had calcified into something closer to institutional legend than lived history. She heard 3 different versions of it in her first week back. One where she disarmed a dozen assassins with her bare hands. One where the fight had lasted an hour instead of 11 minutes. One, absurdly, where she'd thrown a grown Gorath through a bulkhead. And she never once corrected any of them, because correcting them would have required explaining the parts that actually mattered. And those parts belonged to her, not to the mess hall rumor mill. A first-year Ithil cadet stopped her outside the lecture hall in the second week of term. Young, visibly nervous, antennae twitching in a way Iris had learned to read as anxious rather than aggressive, and asked, haltingly, if the stories were true. Some of them, Iris said. Which parts? The cadet asked. Iris considered the question and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she had an answer worth giving a nervous first year rather than deflecting entirely. The part where I was scared, she said. That part's true, even though nobody tells it that way. The part where I didn't let it change how I moved, that's true too. Those are the only 2 parts that actually matter. Everything else is decoration, people add, because the plain version doesn't feel dramatic enough to repeat at dinner. The cadet looked at her for a long moment, something working behind wide, dark eyes, and then nodded slowly. The particular nod of someone filing information away to think about later rather than simply accepting it on the spot, which Iris respected considerably more than blind agreement would have earned. Sergeant Boyd found her at the maintenance dock again on a slow evening near the end of the second week, 2 mugs on the workbench as always, and settled onto his usual stool with the weary satisfaction of a man who'd spent the day doing honest physical work and intended to enjoy the evening that followed it. Heard the new cohorts already turned you into a myth, he said, by way of greeting. Heard the same thing. Bothers you? It wasn't quite a question, and Iris took a moment before answering it honestly. Some of it. I didn't do anything in that corridor that I want turned into a story cadets tell each other to feel brave. I did the only thing that made sense at the time, with what I had, because the alternative was worse for everyone in that hallway, including me. Boyd nodded slowly, turning his mug in a loose circle on the workbench without drinking from it. That's the thing about doing something worth remembering, girl. You don't get much say in what people do with the memory afterward. All you get to control is whether the true version stays available to anybody who actually wants to find it, instead of getting buried entirely under the myth. Sounds to me like you're already doing that, telling nervous first-years the plain version, instead of letting the exaggerated one stand unchallenged. That's about as much as anybody can ask of you. Rake told me something similar, about carrying the truth instead of the story. Rake's a smart woman, Boyd said. Wasted on committee work if you ask me, but nobody does. He finally took a pull from his mug, studying Iris over the rim of it with the same weathered, careful attention he'd given her the morning after the ambush. You did good, you know, not just in the corridor, after it. Plenty of people can survive a fight. Fewer of them survive the 6 weeks of paperwork and politics that come crawling in behind it, without losing the thing that made the fight worth surviving in the first place. You held onto yours the whole way through. That's rarer than the fight was, in my experience, and I've seen more of both than I'd like to admit. She thought about that for a long time after she'd left the maintenance dock, walking the long way back to her dormitory under Vantage's simulated evening lighting cycle, past Corridor 7's seamless new paneling, past the mess hall where Tessely and a growing circle of first-years had started saving her a regular seat, past Ilan Vosk's dormitory wing, where a light was still on behind his window at an hour that suggested he was, in fact, finally reading the assigned texts rather than skimming them. Somewhere behind all of it, the ridicule, the ambush, the panel, the myth already calcifying into something she'd have to keep gently correcting for the rest of her time at the Vantage, was the plain, unglamorous truth her father had put words to over a calm line with 6 seconds of lag between them. She hadn't run. That was the whole skill. Everything else was just knowing when to use it. Tessely found her in the dormitory corridor an hour before the ceremony, both of them still out of dress uniform, and took one look at Iris's carefully neutral expression before saying, with the particular blunt affection the maroon cadet had never once lost since Corridor 7, "You look like you're about to walk into another evaluation hall full of people trying to fail you." "It feels adjacent," Iris admitted. "Different room, same building, most of the same faces in the gallery. Hard not to expect the worst version of a room once you've already lived through it." "This one's different," Tessely said. "Nobody in that gallery today is deciding whether you get to stay. They're deciding how loudly they're willing to admit, in public, what already happened whether they admit it or not. That's a much smaller thing to carry in with you than the last time." She reached out with one soft manipulator limb and straightened the collar of Iris's still-folded dress jacket with the fussy, unnecessary care of someone who needed a small task to do with her hands. "You don't have to be anything today except exactly what you already are. Let the room catch up to that. It's not your job to make it easier for them." Iris held onto that the whole walk to the evaluation hall, and found, standing at attention beneath the same high windows that had once measured her fitness to remain, that it made the waiting considerably easier to carry than she'd expected. The formal commendation ceremony took place in the same wide evaluation hall 3 weeks later, though this time the raised gallery was packed to capacity, cadets and staff, and a handful of delegation officials Iris didn't recognize, all gathered under the hall's high windows in a kind of institutional occasion the Vantage hadn't hosted in longer than Boyd could remember offhand. Iris stood at attention in a fresh dress uniform that still felt stiff across the shoulders, flanked by Tessely on one side and, somewhat to her own quiet surprise, Ilan Vosk on the other, both of them there at their own insistence rather than any protocol requirement, because the citation being read into the record named all 3 of them, in careful, measured language, for conduct during a hostile incursion. Commandant Rake delivered the citation herself rather than delegating it, her voice carrying the same flat, unhurried certainty it always did, though something in the careful phrasing told Iris the commandant had fought, and won, a private battle over every word of it with whichever delegation officials had wanted the language softer, vaguer, less specific about what exactly had happened in Corridor 7 and why. "Cadet Iris Calder," Rake read, "for conduct during an armed incursion that endangered the lives of multiple cadets and staff, including sustained defense of injured classmates under direct hostile action, and subsequent cooperation with a formal inquiry that led to the identification and prosecution of the incursion's funding source. This academy recognizes that conduct not merely as survival, but as an exercise of exactly the composure this institution claims, in its founding charter, to be training every cadet within these walls to carry. Few of us are ever tested against that charter as directly as Cadet Calder was. Few are still meted as completely." The applause that followed was restrained, institutional, exactly the kind of measured response Iris had expected from a room built around Corvin sensibilities. But Boyd, seated near the back beside a scattering of maintenance staff who'd clearly come specifically for this, was on his feet clapping loud enough that half the gallery turned to look, and didn't sit back down until Rake, from the podium, shot him a look that held genuine, weary affection underneath its formality. Afterward, in the reception that followed in the hall's antechamber, Rake found her again, away from the thinning crowd, a data slate in one hand that she turned over once before speaking, the small gesture of someone deciding how to phrase something that mattered. "There's a placement offer attached to this citation," Rake said. "The Joint Fleet Command Academy runs an accelerated officer track, 6 cadets a year, drawn from the full network of combined academies across the sector, trained for command postings on mixed-species vessels. I've never sponsored a first year for it before. I'm sponsoring you." Iris turned the offer over in her mind the way she turned over everything, flat and unhurried, and found that the answer, when it arrived, surprised her less than she expected it to. "What happens to the seat if I say no?" she asked. "It goes to whoever's next on the sector shortlist," Rake said. "There's no penalty for declining, Cadet Calder, if that's what you're asking. This isn't a test disguised as an offer. I'm asking because I think you'd be extraordinary in that role, not because I need you to prove anything further to anyone in this institution. You've already done that several times over, in ways I never once expected to witness in 11 years running this program." "I need to think about it," Iris said, and Rake nodded, unsurprised, and left the slate with her rather than pressing for an answer on the spot, which Iris understood even then was its own small kindness. The reception had mostly emptied by the time a Corvin official Iris didn't recognize, mid-level delegation staff, by the modest cut of his formal coat, the kind of man who attended events like this to be seen attending rather than out of any genuine investment in their content, approached her near the antechamber's exit, a thin, careful smile arranged on his face that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Remarkable ceremony," he said. "Though I confess, Cadet Calder, some of us remain curious whether today's language wasn't rather generously applied. Composure, the Commandant called it. An interesting word for what several witnesses described, off the record, as considerably more violent than the official citation suggests." Iris looked at him for a long moment, reading the careful, deniable phrasing for exactly what it was. The same species of remark Ilan Vosk had once specialized in, dressed now in delegation formality instead of cadet cruelty, testing the same old ground to see if it still gave. "You're welcome to read the full incident report," Iris said, flat, unhurried, no heat in it at all. "It's a matter of record now. 4 professionals came to that corridor to kill me. I'm the only person in it who walked away without a permanent injury. If you'd like to call that generous language, I'd genuinely like to hear what word you'd use instead." The official's careful smile faltered, just slightly, and he found, evidently, that he didn't have a ready answer for that either, and excused himself toward the buffet table with the particular haste of a man who had wandered further into a conversation than he'd intended to. Ilan Vosk, watching the exchange from a few paces away, allowed himself something that, on his slate-purple face, was unmistakably a smirk. "You didn't even raise your voice," he said, once the official was out of earshot. "I didn't need to," Iris said. "I never do." The message arrived 4 days later, routed through a civilian relay that took station security most of an afternoon to trace back to a dead-end account registered on Corvath Reach, the same shipping concern name Vasilan had named in her testimony, though the account itself had been created and abandoned within the space of a single hour, clearly built for exactly one use. It reached Iris's personal terminal directly, bypassing the Academy's monitored channels through a routing exploit security later admitted, somewhat sheepishly, they hadn't known existed. The message itself was short. No threat spelled out in so many words, nothing a prosecutor could easily build a case around, just a single still image of Corridor 7 taken from an angle that suggested whoever sent it had, at some point, had physical access to a camera feed no civilian account should have been able to reach, and beneath it, 4 words in flat trade tongue script: "The account is not closed." She sat with the image for a long moment before forwarding it, studying the angle, the timestamp, the faint reflection of a figure in a locker alcove's polished panel that the sender had either missed or hadn't cared about, a small, careless detail that told her more about the sender's competence than the message itself did. Whoever had built this was patient enough to plan a warning and sloppy enough to leave a shape in the reflection behind them. That combination, she'd learned from 4 other people in 4 other rooms this month, rarely lasted long once someone competent went looking for it. Iris read it once, forwarded it immediately to Rake's office and to station security without comment, and went to her scheduled kinetic session on time, because the message had told her exactly one useful thing, and it wasn't a threat. It was a mistake. "They're telling you they're still watching," Rake said, when Iris arrived at her office that evening, the image already blown up on the wall display. Security officers reviewing routing data in the corner of the room with the low, focused murmur of people who understood they'd just been handed an active lead rather than a closed case. Some remnant of the unbroken line's operational network, probably someone Anieth Carr recruited who wasn't swept up in the initial prosecution. "It's meant to unsettle you." "It's meant to make me react," Iris said. "Change my routine. Request additional security. Give them something to observe, something that tells them the message landed the way they wanted it to." Rake studied her for a long moment, and the same expression she'd worn in the recording booth the day of Anieth Carr's arrest, careful, weighing, arriving somewhere Iris recognized as respect, settled back onto her face. "And what would you like to do instead?" Rake asked. "Nothing," Iris said. "I'd like to keep going to class. I'd like security to run the trace, which they're already doing, and I'd like whoever sent that to learn, the same way 4 other people already learned this month, that I don't change how I move just because someone's decided to be frightening about it. If they want a second corridor, I'll give them the same version of me that was in the first one. If they don't, they've told me everything I need to know by staying quiet after this." "That's a considerable risk to accept calmly," Rake said. "Everything in my life has been," Iris said. "I don't know a version of this that doesn't involve some risk, Commandant. I know a version where I let it change who I am in the meantime, and a version where I don't. I've already decided which one I'm willing to live inside." Security traced the routing exploit within the week to a decommissioned relay station 3 jumps out from Vantage, long since stripped of anything useful, the account's creator identity buried behind enough shell layers that the trail went cold before it reached a name. No further messages arrived. Whether that meant the sender had been satisfied by whatever reaction they'd managed to observe, or had simply concluded, watching Iris's unchanged routine over the following weeks, that the message hadn't produced anything worth reporting back to whoever remained of the unbroken line's network, Iris never learned, and after a while, she found she'd stopped needing to know. She kept the single still image in a locked folder on her terminal rather than deleting it, not out of fear, but because Boyd had once told her, in the flat practical tone he used for most of his real advice, that the surest way to lose a long war was to convince yourself it was already over the first time it went quiet, and Iris had decided, somewhere in the week since Corridor 7, that she trusted Boyd's read on long wars considerably more than she trusted her own hope that this one had a tidy ending. It didn't need a tidy ending. That was, she realized slowly, watching the week settle back into ordinary rhythm, the actual lesson underneath everything the corridor and the panel and the ceremony had tried to teach her in their separate, clumsy ways. Some fights ended the moment the last blow landed. Others simply changed shape, folded themselves into the ordinary texture of a life, and asked to be carried rather than won outright, and she found, turning that thought over on a quiet evening walk past Corridor 7's seamless new paneling, that she was, and always had been, entirely capable of carrying it. The Fleet Command offer sat unanswered on her terminal for 11 days, not because she was avoiding the decision, but because she'd learned, a long time ago, that decisions worth keeping were decisions you let finish forming rather than ones you forced into shape before they were ready. She spent part of those 11 days in the kinetics hall, running drills with the incoming cohort of first years at Rake's informal request. Not an official teaching assignment. Nothing on her transcript would reflect it. Just an extra set of hands the instructors had quietly decided to make use of, given how the new cadets had started arriving to every session hoping, half embarrassed about it, for a chance to work a drill alongside the cadet from Corridor 7. She didn't perform for them. That was the thing she was most careful about, working the mats with cadets 3 months into their first term, still clumsy in the specific ways every first year was clumsy, overcommitting to strikes, flinching from contact they hadn't yet trained their bodies out of flinching from. She corrected footwork. She reset a Maroon cadet's overextended reach 3 times in a single session, patient each time, because impatience taught nothing except that mistakes were shameful, and she had never once believed that was true. "You're a good teacher," Tessely told her, watching from the mat's edge one afternoon, the Maroon cadet's own recovered limb moving through a light drill sequence beside a first year twice her size. "You don't make them feel small for not already knowing things." "Nobody ever made me feel small either," Iris said. "My father corrected mistakes. He never once made them feel like failures." There's a difference, and once you've felt the difference, it's hard to teach any other way. "Is that part of what's making the fleet offer hard to decide?" Tessely asked, careful, the question offered rather than pushed. Iris considered it honestly, watching a nervous Ithel first year finally land a clean redirect on the 3rd attempt, the small, startled pride crossing the cadet's face at getting it right. "Some of it. The offer's a good one. Command track, mixed-species vessels, exactly the kind of work I came to the Vantage hoping to eventually do. But there's something in this, the mats, the corridor, the first years who ask me the plain version of what happened instead of the myth, that I didn't know I wanted until I already had it. I don't know yet if command track lets me keep any of that, or if it's a different kind of life entirely." Ilan Vosk, who had taken, in the weeks since the ceremony, to occasionally sitting in on these informal sessions himself. Not to spar. His species wasn't built for it, and he'd made his peace with that early. But to observe, and Iris suspected, to slowly unlearn a term's worth of careless theorizing by actually watching rather than assuming, offered his own opinion from where he sat cross-legged near the mat's edge, uninvited but, by now, not unwelcome. "For what it's worth," he said, "I don't think the version of you that corrects a first year's footwork 3 times without once raising your voice is a version that disappears just because the uniform changes rank insignia. I've watched you be exactly the same person in a hallway full of killers and a mat full of nervous children. I don't think you're capable of being anyone else, Calder, wherever they eventually send you." "That's either the nicest thing you've ever said to me," Iris said, "or the strangest." "Possibly both," Vosk said, and for once, the smirk that followed it carried no edge at all. She made her decision on the 12th day, not in Rake's office or the kinetics hall, but on the maintenance dock behind the dormitories, sitting on an overturned crate across from Boyd's usual stool while he worked a stubborn coupling loose on a loader drone's hydraulic line, the two of them talking around the actual subject for a good 20 minutes before Iris finally said it plainly. "I'm going to take the fleet offer." Boyd didn't look up from the coupling right away, working it another quarter turn before setting his tool down and giving her his full attention. "Figured you would, eventually. What tipped it?" "The first years," Iris said. "Watching them learn to stop flinching. I realized I don't actually want to spend my whole career being the story people tell about one hallway. I want to be the reason fewer hallways ever need a story like that one at all, training people well enough early enough, that the corridor version of events happens less often, not more. Command track's the fastest way I've found to actually build something in that direction, instead of just surviving my own version of it." Boyd nodded slowly, the particular unhurried nod of a man who'd expected exactly this answer and was pleased, quietly, to hear it confirmed. "That's about the only good reason I've ever heard for chasing rank insignia," he said. Most people take that track because it looks good on a record, or because somebody told them they should want it. You're taking it because you already know what you do with it. That's rarer than you'd think, even in a room full of ambitious cadets. You could have told me that a week ago, and saved me 11 days of sitting with an unanswered message on my terminal. Could have, Boyd agreed, picking the tool back up, returning his attention to the coupling with the same unhurried care he gave everything. Wouldn't have meant the same thing, though, would it? Some decisions you've got to arrive at yourself, on your own schedule, or they don't actually stick once you're standing somewhere hard enough to test them. I've watched enough cadets talk themselves into things other people wanted for them. They don't hold up the same way. Rake received the news the following morning with the same measured, unsurprised nod Boyd had given it, though the commandant allowed herself, briefly, something closer to open satisfaction than Iris had seen from her since the day of the ruling. Command track intake begins next term, Rake said, reviewing the transfer paperwork already populating on her slate. You'll finish this term at the Vantage, sit your final evaluations alongside your cohort, and transfer out at the standard academic break. I'll be sponsoring your placement personally, which means my name goes on record beside yours for the next several years of your career, Cadet Calder. I want you to understand I don't offer that lightly, and I don't offer it as a favor. I'm doing it because I think the fleet is considerably better served having you in a command seat than it would be leaving you here indefinitely as an increasingly overqualified undergraduate. I appreciate that, Commandant. Don't thank me yet, Rake said dry. Command track is harder than anything Dr. Vell's panel put you through, and it won't come with the same clean narrative your fitness reassessment did. You'll be evaluated constantly, by people who won't all have read your file carefully, by instructors who'll assume, at least initially, that a sponsorship this young means favoritism rather than merit. You'll have to prove the same thing you proved in that corridor, over and over, to new rooms of skeptical strangers, for years, before it stops being a question anyone thinks to ask. I know how to do that, Iris said. I've had considerable recent practice. Something in Rake's careful expression finally, fully, loosened into something Iris hadn't seen from the Commandant before. Not quite warmth. Corvin composure didn't often stretch that far even in private moments, but a kind of genuine, unguarded pride that Iris understood, watching it settle onto the older woman's face, had probably been building since the recording booth, and had simply never before found an appropriate moment to surface. Yes, Rake said. I imagine you have. The remaining weeks of the term passed the way the weeks after any genuine crisis eventually did, ordinary work reasserting itself over extraordinary memory, until the extraordinary memory became simply one more fact among many rather than the only fact that mattered. Iris sat her final evaluations alongside her cohort and scored well, though not, this time, in a way that drew the panel's particular scrutiny. Dr. Vell's note remained the last word on the subject of her threat profile, and nobody, apparently, was in a hurry to reopen that particular file. Tessely's regenerated limb passed its final medical clearance with no lingering deficit. Ilan Vosk, to the visible surprise of at least two of his instructors, submitted a xenobiology term paper on comparative Deathworld adaptation that one professor described, in a margin note Iris only heard about secondhand, as the first genuinely rigorous work this student has produced in 3 terms, which Vosk relayed to her with the particular sheepish pride of someone who had discovered, somewhat against his own expectations. That curiosity felt considerably better than certainty had. Instructor Senek stopped her outside the kinetics hall in the term's final week, the same squat, careful Ithil veteran who'd called her back after the reflex lag trial that had started the whole chain of events, and studied her for a long moment with an expression she'd learned, over a full term in his classes, meant he was choosing his words with unusual care. I've taught this course for 16 years, he said. I have never once had a cadet's baseline require me to rebuild half my instructional material around it. I want you to know that isn't a complaint, Cadet Calder, whatever it might have sounded like the day I first said it. It's the nearest thing to genuine gratitude a kinetics instructor is capable of expressing to a student who's just made his entire curriculum obsolete. I didn't mean to make your job harder, instructor. You didn't, Senex said. You made it more honest. There's a difference, and it's taken me most of this term to appreciate it properly. The unbroken lines remaining oversight seats were formally dissolved at the term's close, folded back into the broader delegation's general roster, and the Joint Academy's admission standards emerged from the whole affair not narrowed, as Anieth Carr's faction had once hoped, but broadened, a new provision, added at Rake's insistence and passed with a margin wide enough to surprise even her. Requiring threat profile evaluations to account for a cadet's documented homeworld conditions, rather than measuring every applicant against a single Corvin-drafted baseline. It wasn't a sweeping victory. Iris understood that clearly enough by then to know the galaxy didn't often hand out sweeping victories to anyone, human or otherwise. It was a narrow, specific, permanent correction to one small piece of a much larger system. And she found, reading the notice on the Academy boards the same week she packed the first of her transfer crates, that a narrow permanent correction was worth considerably more to her than a sweeping temporary one would have been. Rake mentioned, almost in passing during their final formal meeting before Iris's transfer, that Dr. Vell had quietly requested a copy of the amended provision for her own delegation's academy back on the Corvin homeworld, along with a private note thanking the panel chair had never expected to write to a cadet she'd spent a full day trying to disqualify. Iris hadn't answered that note directly. She'd simply filed it, the way she filed most things now, in the small, growing collection of plain, unglamorous proof that a room could walk in certain of one thing and walk out changed, provided someone inside it refused to make the changing easy. The night before her transfer shuttle departed, Iris found herself back at the maintenance dock one last time, Boyd already waiting with 2 mugs on the workbench, though this time he'd added a small, battered flask to the arrangement that he poured a careful measure from into each mug without asking whether she wanted it. Regulation says I'm not supposed to do this with a cadet, he said, sliding 1 mug across. But you're leaving in the morning and I've never once in 40 years of maintenance work let a regulation get between me and seeing somebody off properly. Drink slow. It's stronger than it smells. It was. Iris took a careful sip and felt it settle warm through her chest. And for a while neither of them said much of anything. The comfortable, unhurried silence of 2 people who'd already said most of what mattered across a dozen quieter evenings and didn't need to rush the last one. You did good here, Boyd said eventually. Not just the corridor, the whole of it. I've watched a lot of cadets come through this station over the years, girl, and most of them leave the same shape they arrived in, just with better marks on a transcript. You're not leaving the same shape. You came in quiet because you didn't know yet whether this place would let you be anything else. You're leaving quiet because you've decided, on your own terms, that quiet's simply who you are, and you're not asking anyone's permission for it anymore. I don't know if I ever really needed the permission, Iris said. I think I just needed to find out whether people who'd never seen a storm would believe me about what stillness cost, without watching it happen in front of them first. And do they believe you now? Some of them, Iris said, the ones who matter. Boyd nodded slowly, turned his mug once on the workbench, and looked at her with an expression that carried, underneath its usual weathered practicality, something that might have been the closest thing to sentiment the old man allowed himself. For what it's worth, I think your father did right by you, teaching you to stand still in that doorway all those years back. Whatever it cost either of you, watching it. The galaxy's got no shortage of people who'll teach a child to run from what scares them. Precious few who'll teach them to stand there instead and mean it, and carry the weight of what that teaches a person for the rest of their life. You turned out about as well as anybody could have, given what you were handed to work with. Thank you, Sergeant. Boyd's fine, he said, the way he always did, and finished his mug in one unhurried pull. You'll do fine out there, Calder. Command track's going to throw things at you nobody's file will predict, same as that corridor did. You already know the only skill that actually matters when that happens. Tesely and Ilan Vosk found her at the transit dock the next morning, both of them arriving separately but within minutes of each other. An oddity of timing Iris suspected wasn't entirely accidental. Tesely's 4 manipulator limbs moved through an awkward, boneless approximation of an embrace that Iris returned as best her own 2 arms allowed, and when the maroon cadet finally stepped back, her soft round eyes were wet in a way she made no attempt to hide. "You'll write," Tesely said, not quite a question. "I'll write," Iris said, "and you're going to keep taking the direct route through that corridor whether I'm here to see it or not." "Every single day," Tesely said. "I already told you why." Ilan Vosk offered his hand instead, formal in the particular Corvin way that Iris had learned over the term, wasn't coldness so much as a species-specific way of holding something carefully, and when she took it, his grip was firmer than she expected. "I owe you an update," he said, "on the file, the one I told you I'd rewrite." "And still writing it," Vosk said. "Turns out it's a longer document than I expected. I suspect I'll be revising it for years, honestly, given how thoroughly I built the old version. But the first line's changed already, and I don't think it's changing back." "What's the first line now?" "That I was wrong," Vosk said simply. "And that being wrong, corrected properly, is worth considerably more than being certain and never finding out." The transfer shuttle's boarding call sounded across the dock, brisk and impersonal, and Iris shouldered her single transfer case. Lighter than she expected, after a full term at the Vantage, most of what mattered packed into memory rather than cargo, and looked back once at the 2 of them, at Boyd standing a little further off near the dock's maintenance archway with his hands in his coverall pockets, and an expression that held no sentiment he'd admit to out loud, at the whole small, ordinary constellation of people who had, without either of them fully planning it, become the shape of what this place had actually given her. "Corridor 7, she said, mostly to herself, testing the words the way she'd tested 100 harder things this term. "It's just a hallway now, repaired paneling, new cameras. Kids walk through it every day without thinking twice." "That's the whole point, isn't it?" Boyd called from the archway, catching the last of it. "A hallway's only a battlefield the one day it needs to be. Every other day it's just a hallway. You did that, girl. Made it safe enough to be boring again. That's a rarer gift than the fight was, whether anybody ever writes it down properly or not." Iris boarded the shuttle without looking back a second time, because she had learned a long time ago, in a doorway on a moon that didn't forgive hesitation, that the people worth carrying with you didn't need a second look to know they'd made it into the part of you that traveled. The engine cycled up beneath her feet, steady and unhurried, and somewhere behind her, Meridian Vantage fell away into the dark, carrying its repaired corridor and its calcifying legend and its narrow, permanent correction to one small piece of a much larger system, and Iris Calder sat quiet in her seat, hands folded in her lap, already thinking, with the same flat, procedural calm that had carried her through everything so far, about the next room she'd have to walk into, and what it would take, when the moment finally arrived, to stand still in it too. 6 months later, on a fleet training vessel 3 sectors from anywhere Iris had ever called home, a senior cadet twice her seniority stood over her in a crowded briefing hall and asked, in front of a room full of strangers who hadn't yet decided what to make of the youngest command track intake in a decade, whether the rumors about her admission were true. "I heard you got in on a sponsorship," the cadet said, a tall, broad-shouldered human from one of the core worlds, the kind of easy confidence that came from a childhood that had never once required stillness of him, Commandant pulled strings after some hallway thing back at your old academy. Bet the actual work's going to be a rude surprise. The room quieted the particular way rooms did when they scented a confrontation forming. 3 dozen new command track cadets from a dozen worlds turning, half curious, half wary, toward the small human girl who'd walked in an hour earlier and said almost nothing to anyone. Iris looked up from the tactical brief she'd been reading, unhurried, and met his eyes without heat in her own. "I got in," she said, "because I put 4 professional killers on the floor of a corridor without raising my voice once, cooperated with the investigation that took down the man who hired them, passed a fitness reassessment, a panel built specifically to find a reason to fail me, and then spent the rest of the term teaching first years to stop flinching. If that's a sponsorship in your book, I'd be curious what you'd call the work you did to get your seat." The cadet opened his mouth, found nothing immediately useful to put in it, and settled, after a beat, for something that was almost, grudgingly, respect. "Fair," he said finally, and sat back down without further comment, and the room's attention drifted back to the tactical brief with the particular, deflated speed of a confrontation that hadn't found the fuel it was hoping for. Iris went back to her reading. She didn't think about the exchange again for the rest of the day, not because it hadn't mattered, but because she'd learned, over a long, hard-won childhood and one very specific afternoon in a hallway called Corridor 7, that the moments worth carrying weren't the ones where she'd proven something to a stranger. They were the ones like the message that arrived on her personal terminal that evening, 3 sectors and 6 months removed from a corridor she still, some nights, dreamed about in the specific, unhurried way memory returned to the things that had actually shaped it. A short note from Tessely, mostly ordinary academy gossip, ending, as it always did, with the same 2 lines the Maroon cadet had taken to signing off with since the day Iris shipped out. Still taking the direct route, it read, every single day. Iris read it twice, allowed herself something that, on her own quiet face, was the closest thing to a smile she gave most evenings, and closed the message without replying immediately, because some things were worth sitting with a while before you answered them. And she had finally, after a very long road from a grain silo doorway on a moon most star charts still listed by number instead of name, learned exactly how to do that too. Not just the stillness that kept her alive when a blade came for her throat, but the quieter, harder stillness that let her sit, unhurried, inside a good and ordinary evening, and simply let it be enough. Outside the small viewport of her berth, the training vessel cut a steady line through open space, carrying her toward whatever room came next, whatever hallway, whatever quiet crisis some future stranger's certainty would eventually manufacture out of underestimating exactly what kind of person had walked calmly into their path. She didn't know yet what shape it would take. She had stopped needing to know in advance, somewhere in the months since Corridor 7, because she had finally, completely, learned the only lesson that had ever actually mattered. She didn't run, that was the whole skill. Everything else was just knowing when to use it. The emergency alarm on the training vessel Kestrel's ledger cycled for the first time in Iris's 2 years aboard her during a routine border patrol run along a contested shipping corridor. And it wasn't a drill. She was off shift when it hit, seated in the mess hall across from a nervous second year named Priya Anwar who had transferred in from a different combined academy 3 months earlier, and had spent most of that time watching Iris the way the first years at the Vantage once had, cautious, curious, not quite sure whether the stories that traveled ahead of a name were exaggeration or understatement. The klaxon's first cycle cut through the mess hall's low chatter, and Iris watched Priya's whole body go rigid, hands freezing halfway to her tray, the particular full-body stillness of fear, rather than the trained stillness Iris had spent 2 years learning to tell apart at a glance. "Boarding alert," Iris said, already rising, voice flat and even, not a drill cadence, "up. With me." Priya moved because Iris's voice gave her somewhere to put the fear instead of somewhere to drown in it, and the two of them fell into the corridor with a dozen other off-shift crew, the ship's tactical channel crackling overhead with the clipped, controlled cadence of a bridge crew that had trained for exactly this and was, Iris noted with the same flat assessment she brought to everything, handling it well. A smuggling vessel running the contested corridor had mistaken Kestrel's Ledger's patrol markings for a civilian transport worth boarding, a mistake that would cost its crew considerably more than they'd bargained for, and had grappled onto the training vessel's aft docking collar with a boarding party, already cutting through the outer seal before the bridge had finished confirming hostile intent. "Command track cadets to secondary muster," the intercom ordered. "Non-essential personnel to shelter stations." Priya hesitated at the junction where the corridor split, one way toward the shelter stations, the other toward secondary muster, and Iris caught the hesitation in the younger cadet's shoulders, the way she'd once caught a knife's angle in a stranger's shoulder in a hallway 3 sectors and 2 years away. "You're rated for muster," Iris said. "You trained for this. Come with me or go to shelter. Either is the right call, Anwar, but decide now, because the corridor doesn't wait for you to finish being afraid before it needs an answer." Priya went with her. That was the choice that mattered, Iris thought, more than anything that happened in the next 11 minutes, because a choice made afraid and correct anyway was worth more than any amount of confidence that had never once been tested. The boarding party, 6 of them, armed, professional in the same worn, competent way Dreath Corps' crew had been professional 2 years and a lifetime ago, met a command track muster team that had trained for exactly this contingency a dozen times in simulation, and had, until this moment, never once needed to run it for real. Iris moved through the confined boarding corridor the same way she'd moved through Corridor 7, economical, unhurried, using the ship's own architecture. A narrow service junction, a pressure bulkhead she knew, from 2 years of drills, sealed on a half-second delay if triggered from the right panel, to turn 6 armed professionals' numerical advantage into a liability instead of a strength. She didn't do it alone this time. That was the difference 2 years had made, the difference Boyd had promised her command track would teach even when nothing else did. She called the bulkhead seal to a junior officer 3 meters behind her rather than reaching for the panel herself, trusted Priya to hold a defensive line at the corridor's mouth rather than pulling the younger cadet into the center of it, coordinated 4 separate crew members through a boarding action that ended 11 minutes after the alarm first cycled, with the smuggling crew disarmed, restrained, and considerably more surprised by the training vessel's actual capability than their initial target assessment had led them to expect. Nobody on Kestrel's Ledger's crew was seriously hurt. The smuggling vessel's captain, zip-restrained in the aft docking bay an hour later, looked at Iris with an expression she recognized immediately, having seen its precise shape on 4 other faces in a hallway a very long time ago. The particular, quiet arrival of someone recalculating everything they'd believed about the target standing in front of them. "You're not fleet security," he said, more statement than question. "You're a cadet." "I'm a command track cadet who's done this exact math before," Iris said, "on a considerably worse day than this one. You should have run the moment your boarding sensors flagged the collar reinforcement on this hull. Somebody didn't do their homework." Priya found her afterward, on the observation deck, both of them still in half-donned response gear, the contested shipping corridor stretching dark and starlit beyond the viewport, and sat down beside her without immediately saying anything, which Iris had come to recognize over 2 years as Priya's particular way of working up to something that mattered. "I froze," Priya said finally, "at the junction, half a second, maybe less. But I felt it happen, and I've been sitting with it since, trying to figure out if that means I'm not actually built for this." "Everyone freezes the first time," Iris said. "The ones who tell you they didn't are usually lying, or they haven't been tested yet in a way that counts. What matters isn't whether the freeze happens. It's how fast you find your way back out of it, and what you do with the half-second after you do. How do you get faster at that? Iris considered the question, the same one she'd once asked her own father in a grain silo doorway a lifetime ago, and found the answer arriving from somewhere old and settled and entirely her own by now, no longer borrowed from anyone else's teaching. You get tested again, she said, as many times as it takes until the freeze gets shorter than the moment that needs you, and then, eventually, it just doesn't come at all. I didn't get here by being born without it, Anwar. I got here by standing in a doorway young enough, and often enough, that eventually the doorway stopped scaring me more than the alternative did. Priya nodded slowly, turning that over the way Iris had once watched a nervous first-year Ithil cadet turn over the plain truth of Corridor 7, outside a lecture hall on the Vantage, filing it away to carry rather than simply accepting it on the spot. Would you stand in the doorway again? Priya asked, knowing everything it cost you the first time. Iris looked out at the dark shipping corridor, the stars steady and unhurried beyond the viewport, and answered the question the same way she'd answered every hard question that had ever actually mattered, flat and certain, and entirely without drama. Every time, she said. That's not bravery, Anwar. It's just the only version of myself I know how to be. You'll find yours eventually too. Took me longer than I like to admit growing up. You already found the corridor tonight. That's most of the way there already. The alarm didn't sound again that patrol run, and the training vessel Kestrel's ledger carried its crew onward through the contested corridor and out the other side of it without further incident. And somewhere in the quiet hours afterward, in a berth 3 sectors and 2 years removed from a hallway called Corridor 7 that had once briefly become a battlefield, Iris Calder slept the deep, unhurried sleep of someone who had, at long last, made peace with exactly what she was. And exactly what it would keep asking of her, for as long as there were doorways left in the galaxy that needed someone willing to stand still in them.